Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The Fog in Acadia. National Park was like something born of nightmares, thick, all-encompassing and without mercy. It rolled in silently through the trees, swallowing whole patches of ground as it wove between the pines. No breeze touched the leaves, and no animal dared make a sound. It was as if the world itself had come to a halt, suspended in time. Connor Lawson, a park ranger for nearly a decade, had seen his share of foggy mornings, but something felt different today. The air was oppressive, heavy with an unshakable weight that made his chest tighten. He was at his post early, as usual, preparing for his patrol route along the southern cliffs. The radio sat on his belt, the crackle of static occasionally making its presence known, though he hadn't received a call in hours. That was until the crackling voice of dispatch suddenly came to life, cutting through the stillness of the air like a blade. The voice sounded strained, hurried. "Ranger Lawson, we've got a situation. A hiker's gone missing near the Jordan Pond area. It's thick out there. The fog's making it impossible to track. We need you to head out there immediately." The urgency in the voice left no room for hesitation. Connor had worked in Acadia long enough to recognize when something was wrong. The park was vast, almost 500,000 acres of wilderness, and the fog had a way of hiding things. People, and sometimes things that weren't people at all. Connor grabbed his radio, flicking the switch to respond, but before he could speak, the voice on the other end had returned. "Be careful, Lawson. There's something strange going on out there today. We can't get a hold of anyone else. No signals." He turned his gaze out toward the fog rolling through the pines, feeling a shiver crawl down his spine. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the missing hiker. "Roger that," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the unease clawing at his insides. He clicked off the radio and began the walk toward the trailhead. The call was simple: find the missing hiker, bring him back. But there was something about this situation that gnawed at him, like a sense of impending dread that he couldn't shake. The air was damp, almost suffocating. His boots made little noise as they sank into the moss-covered earth, the forest around him eerily silent except for the occasional creak of a branch and the steady rhythm of his breathing. There were no birds, no squirrels, no wind, only the thick, suffocating fog. He called out once, his voice disappearing into the void. "Hello? Anybody there?" The silence that followed was deep and unnerving, as if the very trees were holding their breath. A cold gust of wind moved through the forest, rustling the leaves just beyond the fog's veil. But it didn't offer any comfort. No, instead, it felt more like a warning. Connor adjusted his flashlight, pushing deeper into the mist, the beam cutting through the grayish veil only a few feet in front of him. The trees around him loomed, tall, their twisted forms barely visible beyond the fog. Every step felt like a small act of defiance, each one challenging the suffocating silence that pressed against him. "Hey, if you can hear me, shout," he called again, trying to pierce the thick fog. He felt the tug of anxiety coil tighter in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. It wasn't until he was nearly a mile into the dense forest when the first sign appeared. At first, it was just a faint silhouette, barely discernible through the veil of fog. He stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing, scanning the mist. There, standing motionless in the center of the trail, was a figure. It wasn't a hiker. It was too still, too deliberate in its posture. It wasn't moving, not even a flicker of movement to indicate life. Connor's pulse quickened, his eyes flicked toward the trees around him. Was this some sort of trick? A wild animal? or another ranger who had become lost in the fog. But there was something about the figure that didn't sit right. It was wrong, in a way he couldn't articulate. The silhouette was far too still, too unmoving. "Hey," he called, raising his voice louder this time. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" There was no response. He waited for a few moments, straining his ears for the sound of an answer, but the silence pressed on, thick as a tomb. The fog seemed to draw closer, as if it was listening, waiting. Connor's instincts screamed at him to turn back. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what he was meant to do. Find this figure. Help them if they needed help. He pushed forward, his flashlight beam bouncing with every cautious step. He called out again, but it was as if the figure didn't even hear him, let alone acknowledge his presence. He stepped closer. With every step, the figure didn't flinch. It remained there, unmoving, just ahead, its shape growing slightly more distinct. Connor's stomach twisted. Something about the way it stood, its posture, seemed off. Its clothes were odd, outdated, too old for someone to be wearing in the present day. Dark wool, patched and frayed at the edges, the sort of clothing he might expect from someone who hadn't seen the light of day in decades. But even as his mind tried to piece it together, there was something that sent an unsettling jolt through his chest, a sudden, visceral fear that made his mouth dry. Something was deeply wrong. He stepped closer, his breath now coming in shallow bursts. Just as he reached out a hand to speak again, the fog shifted, just enough for him to see beyond the figure, down the path. There, standing farther down the trail, was the same man. But this wasn't right. The figure hadn't moved. It couldn't have. He had been watching it the entire time, every step, every second. It had stayed in the same spot. And yet there it was, farther down the trail, standing still in the same eerie, lifeless posture. Connor's stomach dropped. The air grew heavier, thicker. Something about the figure felt wrong in the deepest part. Of his bones, his breath caught, his radio buzzed to life, startling him from his frozen state. "Lawson, turn around! Get out of there!" The voice was urgent, panicked, but still distant, coming from the radio. Connor didn't move. His gaze never left the figure. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, the words thick in the air, almost swallowed by the fog. "Don't follow him. Whatever you do, don't follow him," the voice on the radio said, and the static quickly swallowed the last of the transmission. Connor's heart hammered in his chest as he gripped his radio tightly. His pulse was a constant ringing in his ears, louder than the low hum of the fog pressing in around him. He glanced toward the figure, no longer standing in place where it once had been, now a presence, looming in the depths of the fog. He looked, back at the trail ahead of him, where the other version of the same figure stood. He should turn back. He knew he should. But he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the ground. The radio crackled again, another warning from the unseen ranger, but this time there was only static. And then, as if on cue, the figure moved, just a fraction, and in that moment, Connor knew this was no ordinary hiker. This wasn't even a man at all. The air pressed down on Connor with a weight he couldn't escape. The fog had thickened in an almost supernatural way, curling in like fingers from the abyss, seeping into every corner of the forest. His breath, shallow and quick, misted in front of him, but even that seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the dense wall of vapor. It felt like the world was closing in around him, and each step he took seemed to push him further into an unknown, uncaring void. His heart hammered in his chest. The words from the radio, the warning, echoed in his mind, their urgency leaving him with an unsettled feeling that lodged like a stone in his stomach. "Don't follow him," the voice had said. But what choice did he have? The man, if that's what he even was, was out there, further into the fog, standing, waiting, and Connor was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. He shook his head, trying to break the spell. This wasn't his first time in the woods. He had patrolled these trails for years, memorized every twist and turn, the sounds of the forest in every season. But this was different. It felt wrong. The trees, usually sturdy and reassuring, now seemed like looming giants, their twisted limbs stretching out like grasping hands. The thick air seemed to drain the light from everything it touched, making the world around him feel flat and lifeless. The figure, he realized, wasn't just standing at the edge of the trail. It was watching him. Even if he couldn't see the details through the fog, he felt its presence. Every breath he took seemed to be met with 1,000 eyes, observing, waiting. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see it looming behind him. But the trail was empty, yet the feeling lingered. A weight, a presence that wasn't just physical, but something deeper, something unexplainable that pressed against his mind, his very soul. His hands tightened around the flashlight. The beam bounced along the ground in front of him, illuminating patches of damp earth and scattered leaves, but the beam never seemed to go far enough to break the fog's grip. It felt like walking through a dream, or worse, a nightmare, where each step forward only led him further into a place that didn't belong. The forest's usual sounds, crickets, the rustling of squirrels, the distant calls of birds, were absent. The only sound was his own footsteps crunching on the dry, mossy earth beneath him and the ragged breaths he couldn't control. Connor called out again, his voice almost swallowed by the mist. "Hey, anyone out there? It's Ranger Lawson. If you can hear me, shout." His words lingered in the air, only to be swallowed up by the fog. There was no answer. Nothing but silence pressing in from every direction. He took a few more steps, glancing around, his senses on high alert. The trees around him looked like dark sentinels watching without blinking. The air smelled damp, earthy, almost too earthy, like the very ground beneath him was absorbing the light, as though the forest itself was trying to eat him alive. As he pressed forward, the trail seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of him. No turns, no deviations, only the steady march of the path, flanked by towering trees on either side. His boots pressed deeper into the soft soil with every step, but the fog was relentless, swallowing up everything before it. It was as though the world itself was being erased, inch by inch, as the mist took over. He couldn't shake the feeling that the fog was alive somehow, that it had a mind of its own, that it was guiding him or trapping him. He wasn't sure which. And then he heard it, a low, dragging sound, like something scraping across the ground. It was faint at first, just on the edge of his hearing, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right behind him. The sound of footsteps, uneven and slow, dragging through the mist. He froze, his pulse quickening, eyes wide as he tried to peer through the fog. Nothing, no movement, no shadow, no figure. He gripped the flashlight tighter, turning around in place. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The air seemed to grow colder, and his breath came out in shallow puffs, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. He couldn't see anything through the mist, only the oppressive white grey that stretched endlessly before him. Another sound. This one was closer. A low groan, like something or someone struggling to breathe. "Hello?" Connor called out, his voice wavering slightly. Silence. And then, through the mist, he saw it again. The figure, standing, motionless, just as before. But now it was closer. So close that he could feel the presence of it, like a weight pressing against his chest. He swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. His stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. The figure wasn't moving, but Connor could swear it had come closer. Without a single step, He was too far from the radio now to communicate with dispatch, but he knew he had to be close to the trailhead. Just a few more minutes, and he could get a signal. Maybe call for backup. Maybe... Crack. The sound split through the air, a sudden and loud snap of a branch breaking somewhere ahead of him. His heart leapt into his throat. Someone, or something, was out there watching him. The figure didn't move. Connor's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run, to do anything but approach. But despite the overwhelming sense of dread that settled over him, he couldn't bring himself to stop. It was as if the figure had anchored him to the spot, forcing him to take another step forward. The fog swirled, and for a moment, the figure's outline seemed to warp, its form flickering as if it were made of shadows, a mirage caught in the mist. His breath caught in his throat as he strained his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The fog was playing tricks on him. It had to be. But even as the mist shifted, he could see it. The man, if it was a man, hadn't moved, but his clothes, they were old. The kind of old that didn't belong here. Old wool, threadbare at the edges, frayed with age. And something else too. Something that sent a cold shiver down Connor's spine. A faint, dark stain that spread across the man's chest, dripping slowly. Like blood. The sight made Connor freeze. That wasn't right. No one had been reported injured, no blood. But there it was, as clear as the fog itself, dark, spreading slowly across the man's chest, pooling under his collarbone. Without thinking, Connor moved closer, his heart pounding. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He could see it now, the way the fabric clung to the man's form, how the bloodstain seemed to bleed into the mist, mingling with the fog in an unnatural, ominous way. And as he took another step forward, trying to make sense of the impossible sight before him, the figure slowly, too slowly, turned its head. But there was no face. Just a smooth, featureless blur where the man's face should have been. And that was when the mist shifted once more. Not around him, through him. The air grew thick, stifling in a way that made every breath feel like an effort. The fog moved again, swirling unnaturally, as if it had a life of its own. It pressed in from every direction, wrapping around Connor's limbs, his chest, his head, until the world was reduced to a suffocating haze. But it wasn't just the fog. No. Something else had changed. Something beneath the mist. An intangible shift that he could feel in his very bones. He could feel it tugging at him, pulling him deeper into the woods, deeper into the waiting darkness. The figure, still standing ahead of him, was now different. Not just in its appearance, but in the air it exhaled. An aura, a presence that filled the space between them with an unbearable weight. Its lack of face had somehow become even more unsettling, like a blank canvas that refused to reveal its true shape. And that stain, dark, ominous, was still there, slowly seeping into the mist, spreading like a malignant shadow. Connor's pulse thrummed in his ears, the fog too thick to see clearly, but his instincts screamed at him, "Don't go closer." Every fiber of his being told him to turn back, to forget about the hiker, to retreat before it was too late. But his legs, stiff with fear and curiosity, carried him forward, one step at a time. He could barely see the ground beneath him. His flashlight, beam now weak and wavering, struggling to break through the fog. Every time it hit the man's silhouette, the light flickered, as though it too was afraid to expose the truth. The faint, rustling sound of the trees, was that the wind? Or something else, something moving just out of sight? "Hey," Connor called, his voice strained and hoarse, more desperate than before. His hand trembled as he gripped the flashlight, the beam now focused directly on the figure ahead. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. Of course it didn't. But then there was a shift, the slightest of movements. It wasn't much, just a subtle twitch of the figure's shoulder, but it was enough. It was all the confirmation Connor needed. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't just standing there, waiting. It was aware of him. Connor froze, unable to speak, unable to move. His heart hammered in his chest, loud enough that he swore it would give him away, alerting whatever was out there to his presence. His flashlight wavered in his hand, the beam now trembling as his body fought against the overwhelming wave of fear. The figure's head, still featureless, slowly turned. Not a smooth, natural motion, but a jerking, ragged movement, like a broken doll whose strings had been pulled. And that's when it happened. In the few seconds it took for Connor to process the impossible, the figure wasn't in front of him anymore. No, it had moved. One moment, it had been standing ahead of him in the fog, and the next, it was standing a few feet down the trail. The same man, the same worn, blood-stained clothes. But it wasn't the same position. It wasn't the same stillness. This time, it was as if the figure had teleported, moved with a kind of unnatural speed. The way it appeared, as if it had always been there, felt like a distortion of reality itself. Connor's throat tightened, his breath coming faster now, panicked. His pulse raced, a loud thrum in his ears. His thoughts spun in circles, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. But the more he tried to reason with himself, the more the sense of dread grew, coiling deeper and tighter in his chest. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But there it was, just a few steps away. The figure, this thing, was standing on the trail again, facing away from him, its posture rigid, its motionless form like a shadow carved from the mist. Connor stumbled back, his legs shaking beneath him, but his body refused to obey. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run, but his feet felt as if they were frozen to the ground, like the very earth had claimed him. The radio at his belt crackled to life, the sharp static cutting through the thick silence. He fumbled for it, his hands slick with cold sweat. Lawson, the voice on the radio rasped, distant but urgent. Do not follow him. Get out of there now. Connor's eyes snapped back to the figure. It was still there. His breath caught in his throat. The voice, that radio call, it was like a distant echo, a warning that had come too late. He could still see the figure, that unnatural jerky turn of the head, the blankness of its face, the blood stain that had now darkened the mist around it. But there was no mistaking it now, the figure wasn't alone. He saw the shadow first, a movement in the periphery of his vision, something behind the man, emerging from the fog. It was small at first, just a blur, but as it grew clearer, it became unmistakable. A second figure, the silhouette of something. No, someone moving slowly, deliberately. This new figure appeared as if it had always been there, waiting, just out of sight. Its outline was blurred, as though the fog itself was clinging to it, wrapping it in its embrace. The second figure was closer now. No longer obscured by the fog, it was coming toward him, its movement slow and deliberate. But it wasn't the same as the first. This one was different. Its shape was even more distorted, less human, and more like a shadow of something that had long since died. Connor's breath caught in his throat, panic surging through him like wildfire. The air had grown even colder, the fog heavier, and the distant rustle of unseen things in the forest now felt closer. The figure ahead of him, the one in the blood-stained clothes, moved again. This time it wasn't just a shift of its position. The figure turned, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for Connor to come closer. And then, for the first time since it had appeared, it spoke. Its voice was raspy, unnatural, a whisper carried on the wind, a voice not quite human. You shouldn't be here. Connor's knees buckled beneath him, his vision blurred, and the world spun. The voice was wrong. as if it didn't belong to a living being at all, and then everything went cold. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was louder, more urgent, desperate. "Get out of there, now!" But it was too late. The figure's motionless form began to shift, its limbs twitching, jerking in the way something long dead would move. Connor's mouth went dry. The shadow behind the figure grew larger, swallowing the light of his flashlight. The forest had gone completely silent, and the fog felt like it was closing in from all sides, enclosing him in its grasp. Then the fog parted, for just a moment, in that brief window. Connor saw it clearly. The figure, its face now visible. It wasn't human. The moment the fog parted, a wave of dread washed over Connor that nearly knocked him off his feet. In the brief flicker of clarity, his eyes locked onto the figure's face, or rather what was left of it. The thing that stood before him, draped in ancient blood-stained clothes, had no discernible human features, just a smooth, pale expanse where its face should have been. It was like looking at a blank canvas, a face made of shifting shadows that refused to form into anything concrete. It wasn't just a lack of a face, it was the absence of any humanity at all. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a white blank void where something should have been. And yet, somehow, Connor knew it was aware of him. It was watching him, waiting for him to react. His breath hitched, his mouth gone dry. His body tensed, unable to move, unable to scream. Every instinct in his body told him to run, to turn and flee into the fog, but his feet refused to obey. The fog pressed in harder, like a suffocating, viscous substance. His hands were clammy on the flashlight, the beam trembling as his heartbeat echoed in his ears. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was trying to work its stiff limbs after being frozen in place for too long. Each step it took seemed to distort the very air around it, as though the fog was bending and twisting to accommodate its unnatural form. Connor's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, and then, without warning, the fog shifted again. The it was gone. Connor blinked, his heart hammering in his chest, as the fog thickened around him, swallowing the space where the thing had stood just moments before. One moment, the figure had been so close he could have reached out and touched it, and the next it was simply gone. But the silence remained, and with it, the oppressive weight of dread. Connor's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run. His gaze shot over his shoulder, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement in the trees, a shadow shifting, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. His fingers clenched around the radio at his side, but the words wouldn't come. The radio had gone silent, no more crackling voices, no more warnings. He took a step backward, his mind reeling. His thoughts spun in a tight, anxious circle. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the fog. But the air felt colder. The fog, thicker. It wasn't just suffocating now, it felt alive, as if the very environment was trying to hold him in place, to prevent him from escaping. The trail stretched out before him, but it felt endless, like a never-ending tunnel of mist and trees. "Please," Connor muttered to himself, his voice trembling as he took another step backward. The words came out in a whisper, as if he feared breaking the silence that seemed to hang over the forest like a shroud. A low, dragging sound cut through the quiet, not the rustling of leaves or the snapping of branches, but something slow, something deliberate. The sound was almost rhythmic, like a heavy foot dragging through the mud. The noise came from behind him, closer. And yet, no matter how hard he turned his head, there was nothing. Just the thick mist that swirled and shifted with every movement. The dread gnawed at his insides, sinking deeper into his gut like ice-cold hands. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be alone. The figure hadn't gone far. He knew that much. It was somewhere out there, moving, shifting, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The sound of dragging grew louder, closer still, until it was right. Behind him, Connor snapped his head around, his flashlight beam slashing through the mist. The beam trembled, darting frantically, but there was nothing. Nothing visible, nothing in his direct line of sight. But something was moving. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he scanned the surrounding trees, his mind reeling from the growing sense of unease. He had no choice. He had to move. The trail was still ahead of him, but the dread in his chest made it feel like it was pulling him in the wrong direction. But what else could he do? Wait here and become a part of the mist? Become something that belonged to this place? He gripped the flashlight tighter and pushed forward, every step now a battle against the rising fear that seemed to claw at his throat. As he walked, his eyes darted to every corner of the fog, looking for any sign of movement, of life, of anything. The trees grew taller here, their branches stretching out like grasping hands. The light of his flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the mist, offering only faint glimpses of the trail ahead. He felt as though the very ground beneath his feet had become unfamiliar, as though the path itself was shifting, bending away from him. The dragging noise behind him continued, still faint, but growing steadily louder, growing closer. His nerves were raw, his senses stretched thin. The sound wasn't just footsteps. It was something else, something far worse. The noise scraped against the air itself, a sound that sent a shiver through his entire body. A low, guttural whisper came from the trees. "Don't follow him." Connor froze. His breath hitched in his chest. It wasn't the voice on the radio this time. It was deeper, raspier, more alive in its unnaturalness. The words weren't a warning. They were a command that came from all directions. At once, as if the forest itself had spoken, "Don't follow him." The dragging stopped. His mind reeled, grasping at the truth that had been dancing just beyond his comprehension. The figure, the man, wasn't alone. There was something with him, something in the forest, in the fog, watching, waiting. The warning wasn't just for the figure. It was for him, for Connor. He had become part of something bigger, something far more ancient and malevolent than he could have ever imagined. As the silence stretched on, Connor began to take a slow, careful step backward. His eyes never left the trees, never stopped scanning for movement. His heart thundered in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. But the dragging sound came again, closer, louder, unmistakable now. He spun around, and there, just ahead, he saw it. The figure. But it wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving toward him, not in a natural way, not with the fluid motion of a living being. No, it was jerking, like a broken puppet on its strings, twitching with each step. Each movement felt wrong. The figure's limbs were stiff, contorted, as if its body hadn't been able to move freely in years. The bloodstain on its chest was darker now, spreading slowly, as if it were alive, feeding off the fog. It was closer. Much closer. Connor took a step back, the world around him spinning, the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. His flashlight flickered, dying, leaving him in near total darkness. And then, as if in response to his fear, the figure spoke. Its voice was hollow, ancient, and distorted, like 1,000 voices pressed together into a single rasp. "You should never have come here." Connor's blood ran cold. The air around him went still, as if everything in the world had paused for that single, haunting moment. The mist seemed to swirl in closer, the trees leaning in, as if they were part of it. Reaching toward him, the ground felt unsteady beneath his feet, and then it lunged. The world around Connor seemed to stop. Every breath he took felt shallow, as if the very air was being drawn from his lungs. The figure, its voice still lingering in the air, twitched forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a creature desperately trying to escape its own skin. The bloodstain that had spread across its chest now looked darker, almost black, and its shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the trail. Connor didn't know how much time passed in that instant of frozen terror. His mind screamed at him to move, to flee, but his body was paralyzed with fear. His flashlight, weak, dying, flickered, its beam struggling to keep the darkness at bay. The figure's head turned again, the movement sharp and disjointed. It was as if it was not entirely there, as if its body had not yet fully caught up with its mind. Its neck twisted impossibly, and that absence of a face, the smooth, blank expanse where eyes, mouth, and features should have been, seemed to stare directly into his soul. No eyes, no expression, just an emptiness so profound that it threatened to swallow him whole. Then, before Connor could react, the figure stepped forward, but it wasn't just walking. It shifted. In a blink, it was no longer a few feet away. It was standing right in front of him. The air seemed to stretch. The fog twisted unnaturally, and Connor's breath hitched in his throat as he took a step backward, his legs trembling beneath him. But even as he moved, the figure did not walk, did not take a single step. No, it shifted, in the way a shadow might move impossibly fast, slipping between the layers of the fog. The next thing Connor knew, the figure had vanished. It wasn't just hidden in the mist, like it had melted into the air. It was completely gone. There was nothing left but the oppressive fog, the darkness closing in, and the deafening silence that now weighed down on him like an anvil. Connor's heart raced. He swiveled, eyes scanning the trail, the trees. The figure had been right there, and now it was gone. Had he imagined it? Was it the fog playing tricks on his mind? No, he wasn't imagining this. His gut told him that. That cold feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of his neck. It was real. He took another cautious step backward, the hairs on his neck standing on end. Every part of him screamed that something wasn't right. The woods, the fog, it wasn't just the landscape anymore. It was as if the park itself was alive, moving, shifting. He could feel it in the air, in the earth beneath his boots. Suddenly the radio at his belt crackled to life, the sharp static blasting through the quiet of the forest. His hand jerked down, grasping at it, the tension in his body snapping like a taut wire. "Lawson, do you copy?" The voice was strained, desperate. It was the voice of another ranger, one he didn't recognize. The words seemed to pull him back to the present, shaking him out of his trance-like state. "Lawson, listen to me. You're not alone out there. You have to get out of there now. The fog, it's not just fog, it's part of it." Connor's grip tightened around the radio, but before he could speak, the voice cut out, replaced by a burst of static. His stomach twisted as the faint crackling continued for a moment before dying completely. The fog, thick and choking, closed in again. Connor swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, trying to think through the panic clawing at his mind. He had to move, had to get out. He turned on his heel, eyes wide, scanning the trail, his flashlight now useless, its beam barely reaching more than a few feet in front of him. And then, just ahead, he saw it, the figure. It was standing at the edge of the trail, not moving, not making a sound. For a moment he hesitated, his pulse thudding in his throat. He didn't want to approach it. He didn't want to see that blank, empty face again. But despite everything, despite the overwhelming sense of dread, he was drawn to it, as though the very air itself was tugging him closer. He forced his legs to move, stepping forward slowly, cautiously, his flashlight beam casting a thin line of light through the fog. The figure was standing just ahead of him, motionless once more. But now the fog seemed to part around it. The air grew colder, denser, and then it was gone. 1 second there, the next, gone. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away. How had it moved so fast? And then, before his mind could fully process what had happened, the figure reappeared further down the trail. No movement, no step taken. It was simply there, as though it had always been there waiting for him. The blood drained from Connor's face. The figure hadn't moved, it couldn't have, but there it was, standing in the fog, staring with that featureless, empty gaze. How had it done that? How had it shifted again without taking a single step? The fog seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, alive with the same hunger, the same empty void that had been following him all along. He felt the weight of it in his chest, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, even as the figure's silhouette remained fixed, unblinking, ahead of him. "It's not real," he whispered to himself, trying to convince his brain to make sense of what was happening. But the rational thought slipped away as the fog thickened and pressed closer. The woods no longer felt like the forest he knew. His pulse raced again, the panic rising within him. His body, now trembling, fought against the fear, every fiber telling him to leave. But it was too late for that. The fog had already claimed him. As the figure's silhouette slowly, impossibly, twisted again, the same hollow voice echoed through the air, this time low and mocking, as if it were a cruel reflection of his own thoughts. "You can't leave." Not now. Connor didn't even think. He turned on his heel and ran. The world blurred. His flashlight bounced erratically with every step, the beam casting a frantic, weak glow through the ever-thickening mist. The trees rushed by in a blur, the path ahead becoming indistinguishable from the shadows. His breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast he ran, no matter how desperately he tried to escape, he felt it, the presence, right behind him. The dragging noise returned, growing louder, closer. And then, just as he thought his heart would burst from his chest, he heard it, a sharp, deafening crack of a branch breaking just ahead. Something was coming, and it wasn't alone. Connor didn't look back. His legs were on autopilot, each step a frantic, desperate push through the dense fog. The path ahead of him seemed endless, a twisting, indistinct blur of trees, shadows, and mist. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, his breath ragged and shallow, each inhale feeling like a struggle against the weight of the air. The sound of dragging, once distant, was now too close, too real. It was right behind him, each scraping footstep sending a chill through, his spine freezing him to the core. The fog closed in tighter, wrapping itself around him, cutting off any sense of direction. The trees that once stood tall, solid, like familiar guardians, now loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted forms reaching out to snatch him, to pull him deeper into the suffocating embrace of the unknown. Then a crack, a sharp snap of a branch, breaking as if something, or someone, was stalking him through the woods. He spun around once again, the flashlight beam slicing through the fog, but there was nothing. The path was empty, swallowed by the mist. Nothing but silence. It was almost worse than the sound. The silence held a sinister weight, pressing against him like a physical force, making every second feel stretched, drawn out, as though the very world around him had been distorted by something ancient, something malevolent. Don't stop. Keep moving. But his body screamed for rest. His limbs were burning, muscles aching, but still he pushed forward. The distant echo of the dragging sound lingered, like a dark shadow at the edge of his perception, always there, always watching, and then, just as he thought he could go no further, he saw it, the clearing. A sharp break in the trees, a faint patch of sunlight trying to push through the dense fog. He could barely make it out, but there it was. He was close, so close. The clearing meant an escape, a way out, a chance to breathe again. He pushed himself harder, faster, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side, the exhaustion that felt like it was pulling him under. He reached the edge of the trees and the figure was there. It stood in the center of the clearing, perfectly still, unmoving, as though it had always been waiting for him. The fog parted around it, its featureless face locked in the same blank, hollow expression. It didn't twitch, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching him with that empty gaze. No, this wasn't real. He was dreaming. He had to be. This couldn't be happening. But even as the rational thoughts fought for control, Connor felt his legs slow, his chest tightening. The figure had stopped following him. Instead, it was waiting, standing silently at the edge of the clearing, as though it had known this moment would come, as if it had been there all along. He stopped, the space between them stretching. His breath came out in ragged bursts, every ounce of fear and exhaustion seeping into his bones. He didn't want to approach it, didn't want to go any closer, but he couldn't stop himself. It was as if some force, some invisible hand, was pulling him toward it, guiding him. The fog swirled around him as if it was trying to wrap him up, bind him in its embrace. His head spun, his thoughts clouded. He couldn't escape. He couldn't go back. The forest had changed. It was different now, warped, twisted. The place he had known so well for years had become an alien landscape, a place where reality itself bent and broke under the weight of something far older and more powerful. He stepped forward, his legs moving against his will. With each step, the figure seemed to loom larger, its shadow stretching, growing, as if it were feeding on his fear. It was then, as he reached the center of the clearing, that the fog parted one last time. And he saw it, the thing behind the figure. Shadow, a presence darker than the fog itself, writhing in the edges of his perception. It wasn't just one thing, but many, hundreds, thousands of them, like ghosts or memories, flickering and shifting just out of sight. They were the trees, the mist, the air itself, all twisted and distorted into an endless sea of shadow. And, in the center of it all, in the very heart of this dark, twisted place, stood the figure. Its face, or lack of it, was the focal point of everything. Connor's breath hitched. His pulse screamed in his ears. He couldn't understand what he was seeing, but the sheer weight of it, the presence of it, overwhelmed him. He knew now. The figure was just the beginning. The fog was its body. The trees were its limbs. The land itself was its prison. And then, as he looked closer, something else became clear. The figure wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him to do what it needed him to do. Connor's stomach churned, nausea rising in waves. He wasn't here by accident. He wasn't just some lost ranger who had wandered into the wrong part of the woods. The park, this place, was tied to something ancient, something bound to the land. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a veil, a prison that kept them trapped. The figure wasn't alive, and it wasn't dead. It was something in between, something that existed in the cracks of the world, waiting for someone to free it. And then, as his mind finally began to piece it together, the fog around him thickened once more, swallowing everything in its path. But it wasn't just the fog. It was the forest itself, folding inward, closing him in, like a trap that had been set long ago. He was part of it now. As the final strands of clarity slipped from his mind, Connor heard the whisper, the voice. That hollow, distorted voice that had echoed through the trees, through his very soul. Welcome home. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure, closer now, right beside him, its empty face slowly beginning to fill in, as if the fog itself were giving it shape. And then everything went silent. Everything was gone. The next morning, the other rangers found Connor's radio still on the trail. It had fallen from his belt, the static crackling softly. His flashlight was discarded beside it, its beam dimmed and lifeless. The woods, once again, were silent. No sign of Connor remained. No trace. Just the fog, thick and heavy, creeping across the trees, settling into every nook and cranny of the park. And far in the distance, there was the faintest echo of something watching, waiting. Days passed, and the park was back to its usual quiet rhythm. Rangers came and went, the fog still clinging to the land like an old wound. But the absence of Connor Lawson weighed heavy on the others. It wasn't the disappearance that haunted them. It was the way the land felt, the way the fog never seemed to lift completely, no matter how hard they tried to push it back. The morning after Connor vanished, a search party set out. They combed every inch of the southern trails, the Jordan Pond area, all the places where Connor had been seen last. They called his name, but only the trees answered. They found nothing. No sign of struggle, no prints, no broken branches. His radio had been found, abandoned on the trail. The faint static a lingering reminder that something had gone horribly wrong. But still, no body, no trace of Connor himself. The other rangers didn't know what to make of it. Some of them began to talk, whispering about the old stories, the ones that were usually dismissed as nothing more than campfire tales told by long-forgotten hikers. Tales of the fog that swallowed people whole, of strange figures appearing in the mist, of shadows that followed in the quiet spaces between the trees. And then, a few days later, it happened again. A new ranger, Ben Carter, was assigned to patrol, the same area where Connor had disappeared. He had heard the stories, but being fresh to the park, he dismissed them as superstition, the exaggerations of men who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. He was determined to do his job, to follow the same trail Connor had taken, and prove that the park was as safe as it seemed. But as the morning fog rolled in, thick and unyielding, something in the air shifted. It wasn't just the usual dampness, the usual quiet. This time the fog felt alive. It curled around his legs, rose in swirls that seemed to have a mind of their own. Ben felt it before he saw it, a presence in the air, a subtle pull, like the land itself was watching him. He pushed forward, following the trail, his flashlight slicing through the mist. It was early, too early for much wildlife to be active, and the eerie silence gnawed at him. His boots squelched against the damp earth as he walked, each step seeming to echo louder than the last. He was just about to call in his location when he saw it. Something moving ahead of him, faint in the distance, standing motionless in the mist. At first he thought it was just another trick of the fog, a shadow, an illusion. But as he moved closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a figure, tall, unnaturally still. Just like the stories had described, the figure wasn't facing him, it was turned away, but Ben could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him. He called out, his voice betraying the fear that he tried to suppress. "Hey, is someone there?" No answer. Ben hesitated, his hand tightening around his flashlight, his mind racing. Was this some prank? Was it a lost hiker? No, this wasn't. A person. This wasn't normal. "Hello?" His voice was more forceful this time, but again, there was nothing, just the silence of the woods, the muffled whispers of the fog. He took a cautious step forward, his flashlight shaking as he trained the beam on the figure. The closer he got, the more it became clear that this was not a hiker at all. The figure's clothes were old, tattered, faded, as though they belonged to someone long gone. The fabric looked frayed, like it hadn't seen the light of day in decades. But it wasn't just the clothing. The figure's posture, rigid, unnatural, was all wrong. Ben's breath caught in his throat. This isn't right. He took another step, his instinct screaming at him to turn around, to run. But something held him in place. The air around him grew thicker, heavier. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. "Are you lost?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But the figure didn't respond. Something was wrong. He knew it. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach, a creeping sense that he was trespassing in a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The fog shifted around the figure, swirling like it was alive, and for a brief moment, Ben thought he saw the faintest outline of a face that wasn't quite there, that couldn't be real. It was a blank face, like a mask. And then, without warning, the figure shifted, not in the way a person might turn, but in a way that defied all logic. It didn't move. It was simply somewhere else, somewhere farther down the trail, standing exactly the same, facing the same direction, still not acknowledging Ben. Ben froze, his mind struggling to catch up with what he was seeing. The figure hadn't moved, it hadn't taken a single step. But it was further ahead now, as if the very fabric of reality had been bent. He blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind. But when he looked again, it was still there. And then the voice came. It was faint, a whisper that seemed to float in the air, but it wasn't the voice of a person. It wasn't even human. It was a low rasp, an ancient sound, like it had been carried across time itself. "Don't follow him." Ben's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, but the trail behind him was empty. The trees loomed over him, silent and still. But the presence was there, just out of sight, watching him. He turned back to the figure, but this time it was gone. No sign of it, no movement. It had vanished into the mist. The air grew thick again, the fog pressing against him, and for the first time, Ben understood. The land wasn't just part of the fog, it was the fog. And the figure, that thing in the woods, was part of something much older, something that had always been there waiting. He didn't wait any longer. He turned and ran. As Ben stumbled through the fog, his mind was reeling, but his body knew the way. He didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to question the impossibility of what he'd seen. The dragging noise was distant now, but still there, following him. Ben finally reached the edge of the trail, where the fog began to thin. He gasped for breath, his hands trembling, his skin cold with sweat. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, but there was nothing, only the swirling mist, the empty trees. He had barely made it out, but he knew. Connor had not been the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The park had claimed him, and it was still hungry. Weeks passed after Ben Carter's terrifying encounter in the fog. Word of Connor's disappearance and the strange events in Acadia National Park spread through the ranger network. There were hushed whispers in the break rooms, cautious exchanges over coffee. But for the most part, the authorities were tight-lipped. They didn't want to provoke panic among the visitors. After all, the park was supposed to be a place of beauty, of calm, a place to escape the chaos of the outside world. But the truth, as some of the rangers began to quietly admit to one another, was that the park was never the same. It was as though something was changing in the very air. The fog wasn't just fog anymore. It was a presence, a thing that moved like it had a will of its own. The trees seemed to whisper. The wind carried voices that no one could trace. And the silence had grown heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't a silence that offered peace. It was a silence that held secrets. And then, the disappearances started to make sense. Ben wasn't the first to see the figure, nor would he be the last. His warning that the park was no longer safe, that the fog was alive, had been ignored by most of the rangers. After all, how could something so impossible be true? They had all seen the mist in the mornings, watched it roll in thick and heavy, but they hadn't felt its pull. Not like Ben had, not like Connor had. But the park had begun to change in ways they couldn't explain. And some of them, those who had been here long enough, knew what had been buried in the deepest folds of the land. There was one old ranger, Will Harper, who had been with the park since its earliest days. He had seen it all, the floods, the fires, the tourists who wandered too far off the trail. He had never shown fear, never spoken of anything more than the usual dangers of the woods, bears, ticks, the occasional lost hiker. But when Connor disappeared, and then Ben, when they vanished into the mist, something in Will snapped. He came to Ben the day after his return, his old face pale, his hands shaking. Will had never been one for stories. But now, in the quiet solitude of the ranger station, he seemed almost desperate. You saw it, didn't you? Will's voice cracked, the first sign of vulnerability Ben had ever seen from the man. He nodded slowly, as though the words were stuck in his throat. Will continued, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might be listening. It's not just the fog. It's the land, the place, and that figure, the one you saw. It's a part of it. Ben swallowed hard, his mind racing to piece together the bits of information Will had dropped. The fog, the figure, the whispers in the trees, the dragging sound. He felt the weight of the truth begin to settle over him like the fog itself. You're not the first, Will said quietly, as though speaking too loud might make it all come true. There's always been stories, old ones, about the fog, about things that come with it, things that take people, but they never come back. Not really. Ben stared at Will, trying to process the words. What do you mean? People don't just disappear. There has to be a reason, a logical explanation. Will's face tightened, his eyes darkening. Some things don't have an explanation, Ben. Some things are older than the park itself, older than the people who built it. The land has a history, a memory. He paused, the words catching in his throat. And that figure, it's part of it, a part of the fog, a part of the land's curse. Ben looked away, his mind swirling with disbelief and growing fear. The more he thought about it, the more his encounter seemed to line up with Will's cryptic warnings. But how could anyone believe in something so impossible? Will's voice softened, but there was a finality in it. You were lucky to escape. Most aren't. Why me? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. Will looked at him with a heavy, knowing gaze. It chooses, Ben. It always chooses. The land, the fog, that figure, it picks who it wants. And once it does, there's no way to outrun it. You can't hide. It watches you. It waits. Ben tried to make sense of it all, but the terror that gripped him when he thought about what he had seen, the figure, the empty face, the unrelenting fog, held him in a vice-like grip. The truth was simple and devastating. There was no escape. There was no explanation. There was only it. Days turned into weeks, and still the park remained haunted. A new team of rangers rotated in and out, and though the missing were never forgotten, life in Acadia went on. The tourists continued to wander the trails, the fog still rolled in at dawn, and the world outside seemed oblivious to the strange, unsettling force that had taken root in the park. But then, one morning, something happened that no one could ignore. A young hiker named Sarah arrived at the ranger station, looking pale and shaken, a backpack slung over her shoulder. She had come alone, an experienced hiker, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know what I saw, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was on the trail, near the Jordan Pond area, and I saw him. She choked back a sob. The figure, the one you warned me about. I thought it was just a man at first, But when I looked closer, I saw it. The fog was with him. It was moving like it was alive. Ben froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end. The same fear that had plagued him weeks ago crept back into his chest, cold and relentless. He wanted to say something, to tell her to turn around, to run, to leave before it was too late. But instead, all he could do was listen. He was watching me, Sarah whispered, tears streaking her face. I don't know how long I stood there. I couldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place. And then I saw something else. Something in the trees. Something behind him. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, like it was reaching for me. She took a trembling breath. I ran. I don't know how I made it back here, but I saw it. I saw him. And the fog, her voice broke as she clutched her arms tightly. It was waiting for me. Ben's heart sank, his fears confirmed. The fog had taken root in the land, and now it was reaching for more. Sarah wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. There's no way to stop it, Will had said. Once you've seen it, it knows you. The fog was no longer just a physical phenomenon. It was alive, a presence that existed beyond reason. And it was waiting, always waiting, for the next person to wander too far, to fall into its grasp. Ben's eyes met Sarah's, the terror in her gaze reflecting his own. They had both seen it, the watcher in the fog, the one who waited, silent and patient. And no matter how hard they tried to understand, there was no escaping it now. They were both part of it. The park had claimed them, and it would never let them go. The days grew colder as autumn bled into winter, but the fog remained. It had settled deeper into the park than ever before, curling its damp fingers around the trees, the trails, the very air itself. The rangers had stopped looking for answers. They knew there were none. Some left, unable to bear the weight of it. Some stayed, but they no longer patrolled the same trails, didn't venture too far beyond the station. The fog had claimed those paths, and they had learned to keep their distance. Ben had never gone back to the Jordan Pond area after Sarah's visit. It was as though the very thought of returning made his heart thud with dread. The image of the figure standing motionless in the fog burned itself into his mind, like an image from a nightmare he couldn't shake. It was late one evening, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples as dusk began to fall, when he heard the first soft crackle on the radio. It was faint at first, a voice barely breaking through the static, but Ben's heart leapt when he realized it was coming from the Jordan Pond area, right where Connor had disappeared. Ranger Lawson, is that you? Are you there? The voice croaked. Ben's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, it was Connor's, but that was impossible. Connor was gone into the fog. Lawson, it's so cold. Please, can you hear me? Ben's hand shook as he gripped the radio, his throat tight with fear and confusion. He quickly switched the channel, hoping for another ranger to answer, but the only voice that came through was Connor's, weak, distant, and desperate. Connor, Ben muttered, his breath ragged. He had heard nothing of Connor since the day he vanished. No remains, no trace, nothing. And now here was his voice, crackling through the static, begging for help. The words on the radio twisted in a strange, unnatural way, the static warping the sentences. Please, don't follow him. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd heard those words before, back in the mist, from the figure. The voice on the radio was the same as the one that had warned him, warned Connor, warned everyone. The cold, eerie voice continued, desperate and broken. I can't stay. The fog won't let me go. Ben's hand tightened around the radio, his mind spinning. He had to do something. He had to get to him. But there was no way to explain this, no way to understand it. How could Connor be alive out there in that place when the fog had already claimed him? "Connor," Ben shouted into the radio, though he knew it was futile. The words burned in his throat. "Connor, where are you? Answer me." The response that crackled through was not Connor's voice. Not really. It was a broken echo, distorted by the static as though it was something else entirely. Something inhuman. "I'm here, waiting." A deep, hollow laugh followed, the kind that sends ice into your veins. It wasn't Connor laughing. It couldn't be. But Ben knew deep down that it wasn't the fog that was laughing. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him, just like it had waited for Connor. The radio fell silent. No static, no voices, only an oppressive, suffocating quiet. Ben's heart thundered in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears as the silence stretched on. The fog outside the station had thickened again, rolling in slowly, crawling like a living thing. He looked out the window, but saw nothing. Nothing but the shifting mist. The darkness pressed in, and with it came the sense of being watched. His eyes darted nervously to the door, the windows, to the shadowed corners of the room. The radio crackled again, a long, drawn-out breath of static, and then it came. "Come find me, Ben. You're so close. Don't let the fog take you too." Ben's legs almost gave out beneath him. He knew that voice. It wasn't Connor anymore. It was something that had taken him, something that had taken the land, and now it was calling for him. A cold shiver crawled up Ben's spine, and for the first time since he had arrived in the park, he truly felt the weight of its history. It wasn't the fog that was the enemy, but what lay within it, the thing that watched, that waited. The figure was a reflection of the land itself, the land's memory, a dark echo of everything that had been consumed by it over the centuries. Ben stood up from the desk, his hands trembling as he grabbed the radio, but the words wouldn't come. He knew what he had to do, but he couldn't make himself move. He had already seen it, felt it. The fog wasn't something you could outrun. It wasn't just weather. It was a presence. And when it called, you answered. The radio crackled again, and through the static came the voice. "I'm waiting, Ben. It's time for you to join me." Ben didn't need to ask what that meant. He could feel it now, pulling at him. The fog outside was no longer just mist. It was a force, an inescapable grasp that held the land, held the park, and all who entered within its reach. He glanced toward the door. The fog had already crept closer, a soft, slithering movement that reached into the ranger station, curling up against the glass. The trees outside swayed in the wind, but there was no sound, no rustling, no birds, no animals. Ben stepped toward the door, his boots scraping lightly against the floor, the faintest sound lost in the growing hiss of the mist. And then he saw it. Just outside the window, a figure, standing motionless in the fog. Not moving, not speaking, but watching. It was waiting. Ben's breath caught in his throat. It had been there all along, just outside his reach, waiting for him to step into its grasp. The fog had already begun to fill the room, the mist curling around his feet, creeping toward his legs. It was here, the land's memory, the thing that had been waiting. The figure wasn't just part of the fog, it was the fog. Ben took a step forward, then another. His body moved against his will, as if the park had claimed him, like it had claimed so many others before. His hand reached for the door, and he felt the weight of the land, the weight of its hunger, pressing down on him. And as he stepped out into the fog, he heard the final whisper on the radio. "Welcome home." The air outside the station was thick, suffocating, as if the fog itself had substance, like it could reach out, wrap its cold fingers around him and pull him into its depths. Ben stood frozen in the doorway, his breath shallow, his heart racing. The familiar landscape of Acadia, the trees, the distant hills, all seemed to dissolve into the mist, swallowed whole by the unseen force that had been waiting for him. There was no longer a trail to follow, no clear path to safety. The fog had erased everything, as if the world had been reduced to nothing but itself, and standing in front of him, as still as the trees around him, was the figure. It was closer. Now, standing just outside the station, the featureless face looming in the fog, the dark stain on its chest spreading into the mist like ink in water. It had no eyes, no mouth, but somehow Ben could feel its gaze, feel the pull of it, drawing him in like a magnet. The fog swirled around it, pressing closer, as though it were part of the very air he breathed, part of the land itself. The voice crackled again, coming through the static on the radio that Ben still clutched in his trembling hands. It was faint, distant but unmistakable. "Come closer, Ben. You know you belong to me now." His legs refused to move, his body trembling with a mix of terror and something darker, something deeper, like the land was calling to him, like it knew him in a way he couldn't comprehend. The figure didn't move. It was still, frozen in place, but the sense of presence, the presence of something ancient, something hungry, was overwhelming. The air grew heavier, pressing in on his chest with each passing second, until it felt like he couldn't breathe, like the fog was closing in on him, suffocating him. He turned his head, scanning the station, the fog swirling in around him. There was no escape. He knew it now. The fog wasn't just a part of nature, it was alive, a living thing. And it had claimed him, just as it had claimed Connor, just as it had claimed so many others before. The park wasn't safe. It never had been. It was a trap, a place where the land's memory had taken root, where the fog itself had become an eternal, unrelenting force, waiting for the next person to wander too far, to fall into its grasp. The figure stepped forward, and Ben couldn't stop it. The motion was almost imperceptible, the way it shifted closer. No sound, no movement of the ground beneath it. The figure didn't walk. It shifted, bending the very fabric of the fog around it. In an instant, it was standing in front of him, as though it had always been there, as though it had never moved. At all. A cold chill ran through him, and his breath hitched in his throat. He didn't want to look up, didn't want to see the face, or the lack of it. But somehow his eyes were drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. His gaze was locked on the figure, his body refusing to move, to do anything but stare. And then it spoke. The voice was soft, distant, and cold, empty. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything at all. "You have seen it now. You have felt it. You have belonged to it all along." The figure's arms moved, its hands reaching out slowly, fingers elongating, twisting as it extended toward him. But still, it didn't take a step. It didn't need to. The space between them closed with a slow, deliberate pull of the mist. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. His legs felt like lead, heavy, impossible to move. His feet were rooted to the ground, the fog wrapping around his ankles, holding him in place. The world had narrowed down to just this moment. The figure, the fog, the overwhelming presence of something ancient and unknowable. A breath, cold and thick with the scent of earth and decay, filled his lungs. He gasped, choking on the air. But it didn't matter. His body didn't belong to him anymore. It was a part of the fog now, part of the land that had swallowed him whole. The figure's face began to form. At first, it was faint, a blurry outline like a shadow that was too hard to focus on. But slowly, the fog around its face shifted, as though it were being shaped by invisible hands. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he saw it, the face, but not a human one. It was a distortion, a thing that didn't belong to the world. A mask of the fog itself. Its face was featureless, a smooth, pale expanse of nothing. But it was there, and somehow it was alive. It was everything and nothing all at once. And then, as the fog wrapped around Ben's body, encasing him in its cold, suffocating embrace, the voice spoke again, not from the figure, but from the land itself. This is your place now. You belong to it. You are part of it, and you will never leave. Ben's heart stopped. The world around him seemed to shift, bending and warping as though it were made of smoke. The fog reached higher, curling around him, swallowing his body, his mind, until all that was left was the presence, the figure, the fog, the land itself. It was all one thing, all connected, all alive. The trees, the air, the very ground beneath him, it all belonged to it. And then, as he took his last breath, the fog closed in completely, and the land's memory consumed him. The next morning, the station was quiet. No one had heard from Ben since the night before, and when a group of rangers ventured out to check on him, they found the door to the station wide open. The radio was left behind, still crackling with static, but there was no sign of Ben. No trace. No clue as to where he had gone. Only the fog remained, and in the distance, just beyond the trees, they saw it. The figure, standing still, watching, waiting. The fog had claimed another, and it would never let them go. It was the fog that had claimed him. That was what the others came to understand. No one in the ranger station spoke openly about the disappearances anymore, but the silence between them was thick with it. Ranger after ranger had gone missing in the park. One by one, they vanished. No blood, no traces, no struggle, just gone, swallowed by the mist, erased from the world like they had never been there at all. And each time, the fog rolled in heavier, deeper, as though it were somehow feeding off their absence. Sarah, the young hiker who had seen the figure standing in the fog that first morning, never spoke of what happened after she left the ranger station. She had come to warn them, but when she finally made it back to town, no one could reach her. Her stories twisted into something darker in her mind, fragmented memories that broke apart every time she tried to speak. She became distant, eyes hollow, always looking over her shoulder. And then, after a few months, she simply disappeared. Just like the others. The others, those who remained in the park, no longer ventured beyond the immediate area around the ranger station. The edges of the forest where the fog was thickest were avoided entirely. The land around Jordan Pond, the paths that led into the heart of Acadia, were left alone. It was as though they were all waiting for something, waiting for the fog to return, for the next call to be answered. But this time, it wasn't just the rangers. It was the tourists. They always came, as they had for decades, drawn to the park by the promise of beauty, of wilderness untouched, of nature in its purest form. But some were never seen again. Those who ventured too far into the park, those who ignored the warnings. They disappeared, swallowed by the mist, taken by the land like everything else. No one had answers. They weren't even really missing, not in the traditional sense. They simply became part of it, the fog, the land, the memory. They became echoes fading into the wind, lost in the trees. No one really believed the stories about the figure, the one that stood still in the fog, staring with eyes that weren't eyes at all. But then, there were those who whispered about it late at night in the dark when the mist rolled in thick around the campfire, and those who spoke the loudest were always the ones who had never stayed long enough to see it for themselves. Until one day, someone did. Rachel Carter was a seasoned hiker, a woman who knew the park's trails like the back of her hand. She had hiked across Acadia many times before, alone, without fear, without hesitation. The stories didn't reach her, at least not in any meaningful way. She had heard of the disappearances, of course, but she dismissed them. People get lost, she told herself. Happens all the time. But when she set out that morning to hike the trails near Jordan Pond, the fog was thicker than she had ever seen it. The mist rolled in heavy, as if it had no intention of leaving, swallowing the trees, the rocks, the path beneath her feet. It wasn't like the fog she'd seen before. It wasn't normal. The air was dense, cold, and the trees seemed quieter, as though the very forest had fallen asleep. Rachel had been on this trail hundreds of times, but this time it felt different. The sounds of the birds, the rustling of the leaves, they were muted, distant. The wind didn't blow the same way, the air didn't smell right. It smelled of wet earth and rot, as though the land itself was decaying, festering. She pressed on, determined to reach the clearing she had planned for the day. But as she walked, the mist grew thicker, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The trees that once felt like friends now loomed over her like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and turning like outstretched arms. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath her was becoming more reluctant to bear her weight. She called out into the fog, but the sound disappeared immediately, as if swallowed by the mist itself. "Hello?" Her voice was swallowed as if the fog were absorbing it. No answer. Her heart raced, a deep unease settling in her stomach. Something was wrong. She should have turned back, but she was too far in now. Her instincts screamed at her to go back, to run, but something kept her moving forward, drawing her deeper into the mist. The land had claimed others before. Would it claim her too? And then she saw it. A figure standing motionless ahead of her in the fog. It was far enough away that she could barely make it out. Just a shape, a silhouette in the thick white mist. At first, she thought it was just another trick of the fog, some distant hiker or camper who had strayed from the trail. But the more she looked, the more she realized there was something wrong about it. It wasn't moving. Rachel's pulse quickened as she took a step forward, her breath coming faster now. The figure was too still. It didn't sway in the breeze. It didn't react to her presence. It didn't do anything at all. She called out, "Hey, are you all right?" No answer. Her steps grew slower as she approached, and when she was only a few feet away, she froze. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. And that's when she saw it, the face. It was smooth, pale, featureless. There were no eyes, no mouth, just an empty expanse where a face should be. The face wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. But somehow, she knew it was aware. It was watching her with something that wasn't human. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, staring through her. Then she heard it, the voice, the same voice she had heard in stories, the voice that belonged to no one and to everyone. "You are here now. You are part of it. There is no escape." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The fog closed in around her, and she felt the land pressed down on her shoulders, her chest. The earth itself seemed to remember her, pulling her closer to the figure. She turned to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The fog was alive. It wasn't just surrounding her. It was inside her, pulling her deeper into its grip, whispering things in the back of her mind. Her heart raced. The ground beneath her seemed to give way, and with a sickening jolt, she felt the world drop away. The forest, the fog, the figure. They were all connected. They were all part of something ancient, something that had no place in the world. The voice came again, this time louder, closer, as if it were coming from the very earth itself. "Welcome home." And then, nothing. The fog thickened, and Rachel Carter was gone. Back at the ranger station, the radio crackled again, this time with a new voice. But it wasn't Rachel. It was a hollow, distorted echo, like a voice that had been stretched across time. "I'm waiting." The fog grew thicker as autumn deepened into the cold embrace of winter, but it never lifted completely. The land seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for something to return. And it did. The radio crackled once more in the ranger station, its eerie static filling the quiet space. It had been days since Rachel had disappeared, days since the unsettling shift in the air had begun to take on a heavier presence. The mist, as thick as ever, surrounded the station in an almost unnatural stillness. The woods, once filled with the chatter of birds and the rustling of leaves, had fallen silent. Even the wind refused to blow. Ben had long since stopped sleeping, unable to escape the haunting images of the fog, of the figure with the smooth, empty face. His every thought was consumed by the memory of Rachel's final moments, her screams for help still echoing in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure standing in the mist, waiting, patiently, for the next soul to wander too far. And now, there was another voice on the radio. It wasn't Rachel's. It wasn't any ranger's. The voice that crackled through the static was low, hollow, and carried with it the unmistakable weight of something ancient, something that had always been there, a presence that stretched back into the land's forgotten corners, a whisper from the fog itself. "I'm waiting," the voice said, a soft, distorted rasp that seemed to bleed into the static. It wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. It was speaking through the mist, through the very air itself. It was watching. Ben's hands shook as he reached for the radio. He had heard this voice before, just before Rachel's disappearance, just before the last few rangers had vanished. The very essence of the park had seemed to shift, to bend, when that voice spoke. It wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. "Who is this?" Ben forced himself to ask, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. The response came in a slow, deliberate drawl, echoing with an unnatural weight. "You know who I am. I know you, Ben. You've seen me. You've felt me." Ben's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His mind reeled with the impossible. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. The fog, the land, it was all. He gripped the radio tighter, as if trying to anchor himself to reality. "What do you want from us?" Ben demanded, though his voice was shaking now, a thin veneer of authority cracking under the weight of terror. The static seemed to stretch out, almost savoring the silence before the voice responded, deeper now, as if it had been waiting for this moment to unfold. "What I want what I have always wanted, what I have always taken. You, Ben, you are part of it now. You always were. We all are. The fog is the land, and the land is the fog. The memories it carries are ours. You, me, and everyone who walks too far." The fog, the land, the figure that stood motionless in the mist. Everything was tied together, and now Ben understood. The park had always been this way, ancient, alive in ways that no one had ever understood. The people who had disappeared weren't just lost. They had become part of it, part of the land, of the memory. And once you were taken, you never left. Benai, figure standing in the mist, was a reflection of the land itself, a memory of those who had been claimed, their faces erased, their souls swallowed by the fog. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a sacrifice. And once you entered the park, you were never free. The land would wait for you, like it had waited for Rachel, like it had waited for every lost hiker, every forgotten soul. "What happens now?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper, the words heavy with dread. There was no immediate answer, only the faint sound of static, the hiss of the radio cutting through the silence. The fog outside the station seemed to grow thicker in that moment, pushing against the windows, pressing itself into the very walls of the station like it was alive, aware of his presence. And then the voice came again. Now, Ben, you are already here. You are already part of it. There is no turning back. The fog will take what it wants, and you, like the others, will join us. You will join the land's memory. You will become the land's memory. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the world around him began to shift, as if the very air were bending, warping. The walls of the ranger station seemed to blur at the edges, and through the window he could see the figure standing in the mist, just outside the building, waiting, patient. Its face was still a smooth, empty mask, but this time there was something different about it. The figure wasn't just waiting anymore, it was beckoning. "Come to me, Ben. Come into the fog. Join us." The voice whispered, so close now, so real. It was coming from everywhere, from the land, from the trees, from the very ground beneath his feet. Ben's legs felt weak beneath him. His body was drawn toward the door, pulled by something deep, something primal. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight the pull, but it was futile. The fog had already taken him, just as it had taken Connor, Rachel, and every other soul that had ventured too far. The figure outside the window shifted, its arms moving, slow, deliberate, as it reached toward him. The land, the fog, was reaching for him. He could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on him, the air growing colder, denser. The figure had been waiting. It had been waiting for him to understand. "You belong to us now, Ben. You will never leave. You are part of the fog, part of the land's memory." Ben stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord. The door opened with a soft creak, the mist flooding into the station like a living thing. He stepped out into it, into the waiting arms of the land. The figure was there, close enough now that Ben could see the twisted outline of its arms, its limbs shifting unnaturally in the fog, and as Ben stepped into the mist, the last thing he heard was the whisper of the voice that spoke for the land, for the fog, for everything that had ever been taken. "Welcome home." The next morning, when the Rangers arrived at the station, they found the door open. Inside, the radio was still crackling, the static hissing softly, but Ben was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign of his struggle, only the thick, oppressive fog that filled the air around the station, stretching far beyond the trees, and in the distance the figure was still standing, waiting. The land had claimed another. The fog never lifted. It grew thicker with each passing day, until it became as permanent a fixture of Acadia as the trees and the rocks themselves. The rangers who remained did so in quiet resignation, accepting the strange, unsettling truth that the land had claimed them all, one by one. They spoke little, their conversations always turning toward the fog, to the figure that had come to embody the park's darkest secret. Time no longer followed a normal course in Acadia. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days, the mist never giving way, never fading, always present. The park no longer felt like a place of beauty. It had become something else, something ancient and forgotten. The land had learned to wait, to watch, to feed. Those who still dared enter the park, the hikers, the tourists, had no idea what they were walking into. The land was patient. It always waited for them. The voices on the radio stopped. One by one, the rangers vanished. Their radios, their equipment were found, always abandoned, always left behind with no trace of struggle, no clue to where they had gone. And in the fog, the figure always appeared again, still, patient, watching, But then, one morning, perhaps the first real morning in months, a different voice came through the radio. It was faint at first, just a whisper lost in the static, but it grew clearer with each passing second. "Is anyone there?" The voice was weak, desperate. It didn't sound like the land, like the figure, like the fog. It was the voice of a person who hadn't yet been consumed. A ranger, maybe? One of the missing. The static seemed to ripple as if someone was struggling to make contact, to reach through the fog. "Please, can anyone hear me?" The voice came again, this time stronger. The urgency, the panic, was unmistakable. It was a plea for help, a cry that cut through the quiet, pulling at something deep inside those who listened. "I'm still here, but I don't know how long I can hold on. The fog, it's closing in, it's changing me." The transmission was broken, sputtering with bursts of static, but still, it came through. Each crackling word, a shred of desperation from someone who had walked too far, who had ventured too deep. Then, with a final crackle, the voice returned, low, quiet, as if fading into the mist itself. "I see it now. The fog, it's alive. It's not just the land. It's the land's memory. It takes us, all of us, and we become part of it, part of the park. I can feel it pulling me in. I am the land now." A long, eerie silence followed. No one responded, and just as the last words left the airwaves, the static grew to a deafening crescendo, the crackling swelling until it filled every corner of the station. Then, nothing. No more voices. No more static. The radio went silent. Outside the station, the fog thickened once more, swallowing the last trace of daylight. The rangers, the few who remained, did not speak of it. They no longer spoke at all. In the distance, the figure stood, unchanged, unmoving, always waiting. No one had dared venture into the mist for weeks, not since the last disappearance. But some of them knew deep down that the park was no longer just a place. It was something else. It had become part of the land's memory, of the fog itself. And as long as the fog existed, as long as the figure stood, there would always be more to take, more souls to claim, more to consume. The land had always waited for the moment when it would be complete, and now it was waiting for the next. No, one was safe, not anymore, and the fog would never let them go. In the deepest corners of the park, the wind carried a whisper on the air, "Welcome home." And then there was only silence. The fog had claimed them all. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The forest was so quiet that it pressed against the ears, suffocating the sounds that the world had grown accustomed to. A deep quiet, one that seemed unnatural. The man, weary and travel-worn, didn't notice it at first, too focused on the path ahead. He had been walking for hours, his legs aching with each step, but the distant view of Mount Hood still drove him forward. This was his getaway. He wanted to escape, to be free from the noise of modern life, the constant buzz of phone calls, the hum of the city. He had left everything behind. No notifications, no deadlines, no expectations, just the untouched wilderness of Oregon's Mount Hood National Forest, a place as wild and ancient as the earth itself. After hours of hiking, he had found the perfect spot, a small clearing nestled in the embrace of towering trees. There was a slight slope in the earth, the ground soft but solid, and the foliage thick enough to keep prying eyes at bay. He dropped his backpack with a grunt, letting the strap slip from his shoulders, and looked around. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching him with ancient eyes. The air smelled of pine and earth, a scent rich with the promise of solitude. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the clearing. The woods felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The quiet was almost oppressive, though it wasn't an unusual kind of silence. He had camped before in forests like these, and the quiet of the woods was always a thick, living thing. He didn't mind it. It felt peaceful, even if it was unnerving. He set to work, methodical and practiced, pitching his tent first. The fabric rustled as he unfurled it, the poles slipping together easily. There was a sound of a distant rustling in the trees, but it didn't concern him. The forest was full of life, and even when it was quiet, things moved in the shadows. He had brought a small camp stove with him just in case, but he preferred the simplicity of a fire. So he gathered wood, the dry branches cracking under his fingers as he arranged them into a small pile. The night was coming, and he wanted to be ready for it. He struck a match, the flame catching in the dry tinder, and for a moment, there was light. The fire flickered, crackling softly, sending shadows stretching across the trees. The warmth was a welcome relief from the chill creeping in with the dusk. He sat on a nearby log, staring into the fire, his mind wandering. The forest was darkening, quickly the shadows growing long, but the flicker of the flames seemed to push them back. He heard an owl in the distance, its call echoing through the trees, followed by the soft, rhythmic hum of crickets. It was the familiar, comforting sounds of the woods, the same symphony that had sung him to sleep countless times in the past. But now, as he sat there, something began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. A strange feeling, like something was off. It was as if the forest wasn't just quiet, but too quiet. The sounds of the evening, those usual whispers of nature, had stopped. There was no wind in the trees, no distant rustling, no whispers of small creatures darting through the underbrush. It was a silence that hung thick in the air, one that felt wrong. He stood up, his muscles stiff from sitting too long, and stretched, trying to shake off the feeling. It was nothing, just his mind playing tricks after a long day of hiking. He walked over to his tent, zipping the flap closed. He would rest for a bit, take a nap to shake the feeling off. The exhaustion from the day would surely lull him into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The night wore on, the sky now a velvet black studded with stars, the moon a thin sliver in the sky. The fire crackled low as he lay in his sleeping bag, the warm heat of the embers still reaching him. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. He could hear the faint shuffle of wind moving through the trees now, though it was light, almost imperceptible. The forest was alive again. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. But just as he was drifting into a dreamless sleep, something changed. The night, the forest itself, shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the air, a change in the hum of the forest, like a pressure building in the atmosphere. But then the sound, the hum, stopped. There were no owls, no crickets, no wind. The fire was the only thing that still breathed in the silence, its embers crackling, though even that seemed far away, muffled. His heartbeat, which had been steady, now felt too loud in the absence of all the usual noises. He lay there for a moment, tense, his mind trying to rationalize the change. It was just the quiet of the night, wasn't it? The cold, the hour, the shift from dusk to full nightfall. But then the weight of the silence pressed deeper, heavier. It wasn't normal. And that thought, just that simple, undeniable thought, brought his eyes wide open in the dark. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes darting to the shadows, the shapes of the trees looming around him like watching sentinels. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that was deeper than the stillness of the woods. It was as though the forest itself was waiting. And then it happened. A single noise, a tiny noise at first, almost imperceptible, but so stark in the quiet of the forest that it made his heart race. The distinct, sharp crack of a branch snapping underfoot. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He held his breath, straining to hear, but the forest remained still. Not even the wind stirred. He tried to convince himself it was just an animal, something small, perhaps a squirrel. But it didn't feel right. He had been in the woods enough to know the sounds of the forest, and this was wrong. It was too deliberate, too human. His mind raced, the creeping dread settling into the pit of his stomach. He was alone, miles away from any trail or help. His eyes darted back and forth across the tent, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The sounds of nature had disappeared completely. Even the fire felt distant now, its crackling too faint, the flames casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the trees. Suddenly, he couldn't stand it anymore. He unzipped the tent quickly, the sound of the zipper harsh in the suffocating silence, and stepped out into the night. The world outside was unnervingly still, the air thick with tension. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, watching. He took a few slow steps, his eyes scanning the clearing for anything, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. He could just make out the faint outline of the trees, the dim light of the dying embers in his fire pit. Everything looked normal. Except when his eyes turned to where his campsite had been, there was nothing. The tent, the fire pit, his gear. Everything had disappeared. He blinked. Twice. There was no sign that he had ever been there. No sign of the tent, the fire, nothing. As if the forest had erased every trace of his presence. His heart pounded in his chest. He stepped forward, stumbling over uneven ground, and turned in a slow circle, hoping to see some trace of what was once there. There was nothing. Only the endless dark trees, stretching infinitely into the night. He reached down, his breath coming fast, and touched the ground where his tent had been. It was soft, undisturbed earth, as though he had never set foot there. His chest tightened, his mind reeled, but then his gaze fell on the ground. His footprints, his own footprints, clearly visible in the earth, leading toward the center of the clearing, right to where his tent had been, but there were no footprints leading out, just his footprints leading in, as if he had walked in but never left. The hairs on his neck prickled as his breath caught in his throat. "Where's my camp?" He whispered into the night, but the woods gave no answer. The man's heartbeat quickened, the thudding in his chest like a war drum in the oppressive silence. He blinked at the footprints, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His feet, his own, had walked this path, leaving clear impressions in the soft earth. There was no mistaking it. He had been here. Just moments ago, he had pitched his tent, gathered wood for a fire, felt the warmth of the flames, heard the rustle of the trees above him. But now, there was nothing. His campsite, his fire, his gear, all gone. He took a deep breath, attempting to steady himself, but the air felt colder now. The night pressed in on him from every side, heavy and suffocating. His footsteps were the only sounds, his breath, shallow and erratic, nothing else. Not even the faintest rustle of leaves or distant cry of an owl. The forest was dead. He swallowed, forcing himself to focus. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe the wind had blown everything away, or maybe, no. His mind rejected the thought. It wasn't possible. He had been certain when he set up his camp. He had seen everything in place. The tent, the fire, His backpack. He wasn't imagining this. He bent down, his knees cracking in the cold, and ran his fingers over the ground where the footprints led. The earth was damp but firm, untouched by any strange forces. He followed the trail with his eyes, walking the path his feet had once taken, as though retracing his own steps could make sense of the absurdity of it all. There was something deeply wrong. The footprints were clear. He had walked in. He had set up camp, and yet there was no trace of him now, nothing. Not even the scent of the fire remained in the air. The very smell of his presence had vanished, leaving nothing but the damp, earthy scent of the night. He stood up slowly, his fingers gripping the sides of his head. Panic was creeping up his spine like a cold, invisible hand. His mind flailed. For answers, none came. He took another step forward, glancing toward the trees, the darkness beyond them, hoping to spot something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the cold, vast emptiness of the night, the endless shadows that stretched before him. His breath came faster now, and his stomach churned with a fear that he couldn't place. It wasn't the fear of a bear or a wolf, not the usual dangers of the wilderness. No, this fear was deeper, primal, a fear of something that shouldn't be there, something watching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, making the branches sway and creak. The sound was louder than it should have been, sharp and aggressive, but it offered him no comfort. It only seemed to make the night feel even colder, the trees even more oppressive. He spun around, half expecting to see something move in the shadows, but no, nothing. He could feel his nerves tightening. Every corner of his mind screamed at him to leave, to run. But where would he go? He was miles from any trailhead. He could wander blindly through the woods, but he knew it would be pointless. Then he heard it again. The sound. That faint, sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. It was coming from behind him, just outside the reach of the fire's dying glow. He froze, turning slowly. His eyes darted across the darkness, his breath shallow, trying to see beyond the night. There was nothing, just the endless trees, their twisted shapes standing like silent witnesses. He exhaled slowly, his breath catching in his throat, but he couldn't stop the dread creeping into his bones. It was the silence that was the most unsettling, the weight of it, the way it pressed in from all sides. There was no rustle of leaves, no wind. The forest, usually alive with the whispers of night, felt like an abandoned tomb. The sound of his own heartbeat thudded in his ears, too loud, too noticeable. Another crack, closer this time. His eyes flicked back to the edge of the clearing. There, at the edge of the trees, something moved. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a creature. No. This movement was deliberate, controlled, like something, or someone, was hiding in the shadows, watching him. His pulse surged. He felt the hairs on his neck rise. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking, though he tried to keep it steady. His words hung in the air, swallowed by the vast, eerie stillness. There was no answer. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift, growing darker, more ominous. He stepped back, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he moved closer to where his tent had been, now nothing more than an empty patch of grass. A low growl rumbled from the trees. It wasn't an animal growl, not the deep, guttural noise of a bear or a wolf. No, this sound was low and unsettling. A growl that seemed to vibrate in the air itself, as if the forest itself were alive, responding to something. Something in the dark. His breath quickened. The growl cut through the silence like a knife, and then, just as quickly as it came, it stopped. Nothing. His legs felt weak beneath him. He needed to move, to get out of the clearing, but every instinct told him to stay where he was. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee the shadow that hovered just beyond his sight, but his body refused to obey. The growl had come from the forest. It had come from the trees. Something in the shadows. Someone was out there. He took a shaky step backward, his eyes locked on the trees, trying to pierce the darkness. The night had become oppressive, a blanket of blackness that suffocated him from all sides. The growl came again, louder, closer. This time he couldn't stand it. Fear pushed him into action. He turned and bolted, his boots pounding against the earth, heart racing in his chest as the woods closed in around him. His breath came in sharp gasps, his vision narrowing with panic. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, the growl followed. The sound echoed through the trees, reverberating in his chest, a promise of something dark and hungry that was always just behind him, waiting to catch him in the night. Then, just as his legs felt like they would give out, he stumbled, his foot catching on something. He fell to the ground with a sickening thud, his hands scraping against the earth as he tried to catch himself. And that's when he saw it. A shadow. A figure. It was just ahead of him, standing between the trees. The figure was indistinct at first, a shape that wavered in the darkness, like a mirage. But then, as his breath slowed, he saw it clearly. A form, tall, dark, and unnaturally still. The shadow of a person, or something that was once a person. The figure didn't move. It just watched him, standing motionless, its presence heavy in the air. And then it whispered, "Leave." The voice was soft, almost a breath, but it carried with it an unmistakable sense of finality. It was not an offer. It was a command. His body locked up, his mind spinning. He couldn't run. He couldn't breathe. All he could do was stare at the figure, unable to tear his eyes away from the shadow that seemed to grow darker the longer he looked. "Leave," it whispered again. The words were like a cold wind that swept through him, chilling him to the bone. The figure stepped forward. The figure took a slow step forward, its shape blurring in the flickering light of the dying fire behind him. He couldn't make out its features, not fully, just the outline of something impossibly tall and thin, like a shadow made flesh. The night seemed to press closer, folding in around him, and the figure loomed over him like an unseen giant, its presence suffocating. His heart raced, each beat louder than the last. The cold air wrapped around him, colder now than before, as though the very essence of winter had crept into his bones. His legs trembled, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen, trapped in the grip of the figure's gaze, if it even had eyes. It didn't need them. He felt its presence in every corner of his mind, in every inch of his skin. It was as if the very air around him was charged with something dark, something ancient, something that should not be in this world. "Leave," the voice repeated, this time carrying a weight, a command. The whisper was almost sweet in its softness, like a lullaby, but there was nothing kind in it. There was only the cold, heart-stopping dread that crawled up his spine, squeezing the air from his chest. He tried to speak, to shout, to break the suffocating silence, but his throat felt tight. His words came out as a strained, hoarse rasp, barely audible over the sound of his hammering pulse. Who are you?" The words tasted strange in his mouth, foreign, as though they didn't belong there. The figure did not answer, at least not in the way he expected. Instead, it tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. The longer it stared at him, the more its form seemed to shift, the edges of its shape becoming indistinct, as though it were being swallowed by the very darkness it emerged from. He could feel its attention on him, intense, unblinking, as though it were weighing his every thought. "Leave," it repeated, each word drawn out like a slow breath in the cold night. The words sank into his chest, clenching his heart, tightening his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee as far as possible, but his feet remained rooted in place, as though the earth itself had a claim on him, holding him in this unnatural stillness. A tremor ran through him. He could hear his breath now, quick, shallow gasps, and every inhale made the night seem deeper, darker. The weight of the figure's presence pressed on him, and for a brief moment he wondered if he were dreaming, if he had fallen asleep by the fire, and this was all a nightmare. But the cold, the sharp sting of the wind against his skin, the earth beneath him, everything felt too real, too dangerous. He tried again to move, to do something, but the fear was too strong. His limbs felt heavy, unwilling to obey, and the figure's silence was more terrifying than any growl or whisper it could have made. Every second it stood there unmoving sent a cold shiver deep into his soul, as if it were waiting for him to do something, or to understand something. "Please," he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "Please, just let me go." The figure did not respond. It didn't need to. It simply was. The shadows around it seemed to grow, as if feeding off its presence. The darkness closed in on him, warping the trees, distorting the world around him. The edges of the forest blurred and twisted, the outline of the clearing thinning like paper curling at the edges in the firelight. Then came the sound. A rustle, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the wind, or the usual creatures of the night. No, this was different. The sound came from behind the figure, from within the very trees that encircled the clearing, the deep shadows where the darkness pooled and twisted. The sound of something moving, something alive, a low rhythmic creaking, like the bending of ancient wood under immense pressure, followed by a sudden, sharp snap of branches. He spun around, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive night. The trees were still, silent, unmoving. The rustling sound continued, louder now, coming from everywhere, pressing in from all sides. It felt like the very trees were bending closer, their branches stretching toward him, twisting in grotesque shapes that didn't seem quite right. He glanced back at the figure, still there, still watching, unblinking, and he saw it. Just for a moment, a flicker in the darkness behind the figure, something moving at the edges of the shadows, and then it was gone. In that brief instant, the figure shifted. Its form wavered, its silhouette rippling as though it were made of liquid shadow. The face, if it had one, seemed to contort, an unsettling stretch of darkness where features should have been. The whisper in the air felt like it carried weight now, like it was pulling the very life from his chest. He could taste the fear on the back of his tongue. Leave. It wasn't a request. It was an inevitability. The figure seemed to draw closer, its elongated shape growing in the dim light, bending and twisting unnaturally, as if it existed outside the laws of reality itself. The shadows around it seemed to move, shifting as though they had a life of their own. His breath caught. The sound of the rustling branches grew louder, the trees seeming to sway with a deep, unholy rhythm. And then the figure spoke again. But this time the voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a chorus of low, dark sounds that filled the air, the ground, and the sky, reverberating in his chest like a growl of something ancient, something wrong. "You should not have come here." The words struck him like a blow, cold and sharp, and his mind reeled with a realization, one that crashed through his consciousness like a wave. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't just some wandering spirit or forest entity. No, this place, this clearing, was never meant for humans. And as the figure drew closer, its form becoming clearer in the flickering light of his dying fire. He saw it. The shape was no longer just shadow. It was something else, something more. It was not human. It was not even a creature. It was something born of the forest itself, a manifestation of its darkness, its ancient, unspoken power. The figure was him. Not his exact form, but something that mirrored him, twisted by the forest's hunger. The forest had claimed him somehow, or at least his essence. He wasn't just a visitor here, he was an intruder. It moved, slow and deliberate, as though savoring each step it took toward him, its shape blending in and out of the night like smoke. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, the earth itself pulling him down, tightening around his legs like invisible chains. Leave. The voice was not just a command anymore, it was a plea. He wasn't sure if it was his own voice or something else, something far more primal, far more desperate. But it didn't matter. The figure reached out a hand, long, dark fingers stretching toward him. His pulse raced. His body screamed at him to run, to escape, to do anything to avoid the touch of this thing. But the shadows were already there, closing in, wrapping around his limbs like thick, inescapable vines. The whispers grew louder. "You have already been claimed." And then, in a blink, everything went black. When the darkness consumed him, it was not like closing his eyes. It was as though the world itself folded in on him, like the fabric of reality was being torn away. The very air disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty, suffocating void. His body went rigid, his mind frantically grasping at any thread of thought, but there was no ground beneath him, no sense of direction, no time, only the deep, engulfing silence. Then, slowly, a sound began to emerge from the void, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. At first, it was too faint to understand, just the rustling of wind through dead leaves, the sound of a distant heartbeat echoing through a hollow chest. But as it grew louder, the words became clearer. It was not a language he knew. It was ancient. The syllables felt like they were scraping at his very soul, resonating with a deep, primal fear that sent his mind spinning. The shadows around him stirred, becoming tangible, solidifying into something more than just darkness. He felt them pressing against his skin, like cold fingers tracing his form. The air was thick with something foul, something old, like the smell of damp earth mixed with the rotting sweetness of decay. The suffocating feeling returned, pulling at his lungs as he struggled to breathe, and then light. But it was not a comforting glow. It was an unnatural, sickly yellow light, pulsating in the distance, barely visible at first, like the flicker of a dying flame. The shadows recoiled from it, shifting away in an almost desperate attempt to avoid the light's touch. He couldn't move. His limbs were bound, weighed down by an unseen force, his body frozen in place. His heart thundered in his chest, every beat a deafening thud in the otherwise oppressive silence. The whispers grew louder now, a chorus of voices rising and falling in a maddening rhythm. They were all around him, swirling in the air, filling his head with strange, distorted words that seemed to twist and bend, impossible to fully grasp. The light began to draw closer, its pulse quickening, and with it the shadows recoiled even further, as though they feared it, or perhaps it feared the light. The man's mind raced. Was this the end? Had the forest truly claimed him, as it had claimed so many others before? He wanted to scream, to break free from the dark grip that held him, but no sound came. There was nothing but the terrible pressure of the void pressing in on all sides, slowly suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its relentless grasp. The light flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls of the void. And then, from the edge of that flickering glow, he saw it, a figure indistinct at first, blending with the swirling darkness. But as it stepped closer, the shape became clearer. It was not the figure from before, the one that had stood like a sentinel in the forest. No, this was something else. This one was humanoid, but its form was twisted, malformed. Its limbs were too long, too thin, the bones seeming to stretch beyond human limits, a grotesque parody of the human body. Its face was blank, no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, empty surface. But the light, though faint, revealed something that made his blood run cold. The figure's form was not solid, but shifting, rippling in and out of focus as though it existed in multiple realities at once. He tried to move again, but his body refused to obey. His skin crawled as the figure came closer, its elongated arms stretching toward him, its presence suffocating the air. It didn't make a sound, but the silence around it seemed to press even harder, as if the world itself held its breath. In an instant, the figure reached out, its fingers grazing his cheek. The touch was cold, like ice against his skin, sending a shock of pain through his body. It wasn't physical pain, though. It was something far worse. It was as though the touch burned through him into his very core, reaching places inside him that had long been buried, places that were never meant to be unearthed. The whispers in his mind became louder, sharper, incoherent, a cacophony of voices that screamed and wept, filling his head with horror. "Leave," they whispered, but it was too late. "You are already here," they echoed, and he realized with a dawning horror that this place, this void, was not something that could be escaped. It wasn't just a location in the forest. It wasn't just a place within the world. It was a part of him. The figure leaned closer, and now he could feel its presence behind his eyes, in his thoughts, like an intrusive parasite. It had no face, no name, no identity, yet it was him. It reflected his deepest, most hidden fears, his unspoken regrets. It wasn't just some ghostly entity. It was a manifestation of something he had brought with him, something dark that he had carried unknowingly into the wilderness. The coldness in his chest deepened as he realized the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't a place where he had simply gotten lost. No, he had walked into something far worse. He had awakened something in himself. The entity, the figure, it was not just a shadow of the forest. It was a reflection of his own deepest trauma. It had always been with him. He had just never seen it before. "Please," he whispered, though the words felt weak in his mouth. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to get away." The figure's fingers tightened on his skin, its coldness seeping deeper, spreading like ice through his veins. It didn't respond. Instead, it continued to gaze at him with its empty face, an unblinking, silent observer of his terror. And then, the whispers grew louder, until they drowned out everything else. "You cannot escape," they hissed, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You are already part of this place." With a jolt, his body lurched awake. The ground beneath him was hard, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The fire, still crackling faintly, flickered in front of him, its light casting twisted shadows across the clearing. He was back in the forest, his forest, the same place where he had set up camp, where he had fallen asleep. But it wasn't the same. The shadows were darker now, more oppressive. The silence was thicker, heavier, like a blanket over the world. His breath caught in his throat, a cold knot of fear settling deep in his stomach. He scrambled to his feet, looking around wildly, his eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing. No figure, no twisting shadows, no eerie whispers. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it had all been a dream, a trick of his mind brought on by exhaustion. Maybe the solitude, the endless hours of hiking, the isolation had played tricks on him. Maybe he had imagined it all. But as his eyes scanned the clearing, his heart stopped in his chest. The footprints were back. His own footprints, clear as day, leading into the clearing, just like before. But there was no trail leading out. He turned, his blood running cold, and saw it. The trees had closed in around him, their branches tangled in a way that he hadn't remembered before. The clearing, the very space he had once known, was now a maze, an inescapable labyrinth of twisted trunks and thick underbrush, and above it all, the figure stood, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Its dark silhouette watched him, unmoving. The shadows clung to its form, and in the dim light, its empty face, still blank, still featureless, stared at him as if it were waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to make the final realization. There was no way out. The forest was no longer just a place. It had become a prison, and it was his prison. The man's mind reeled as his eyes locked on the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum of impending doom. The darkness around him had thickened, the shadows deepening, pressing in on him as if they were alive, watching, waiting. He stumbled backward, his legs shaky and unsteady, the weight of fear clinging to him like a suffocating fog. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes darted frantically between the trees, desperate for any sign of escape. But the forest had changed. The trees were no longer the friendly, towering sentinels they had once been. Now, they were twisted, gnarled, their trunks knotting together as if trying to keep him from leaving. The path he had walked only hours before, one that had seemed so clear, so open, was gone. The forest was a maze now, a labyrinth of thorns and dark silhouettes, shifting and warping with every step he took. The very ground beneath him seemed to pulse, vibrating with an ancient energy that made his skin crawl. The figure at the edge of the clearing hadn't moved, but it didn't need to. Its presence was a weight, a suffocating pressure that held him in place, like an invisible hand gripping his chest. He couldn't tear his gaze away. There was something about it, something wrong. The shadows clung to it, wrapping around its form like a cloak, its shape flickering in and out of focus, as though it weren't quite of this world. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself, trying to convince himself that he could escape. This had to be a dream. It had to be. He just needed to wake up. But when he opened his eyes, the clearing was the same, dark, oppressive, full of shifting shapes and hidden threats, and the figure remained, watching. "Why won't you leave me alone?" His voice cracked as the words left his mouth, a pleading whisper that was barely audible in the thick silence. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. It never did. It was the silence that answered him, the deafening quiet that made his skin crawl. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. No, this silence was heavy. It was as though the forest itself had closed its ears to him, as though every sound had been swallowed up by the endless void that stretched between him and the thing that watched. He took a step forward, his legs shaky, but the air felt wrong. The very act of moving felt unnatural, as though the ground was pulling him down, holding him in place. The closer he got to the edge of the clearing, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was like walking through water, each step more laborious than the last. The trees around him seemed to stretch higher, their limbs twisting in grotesque shapes, blocking the sky, suffocating the light. Then, just as his foot hovered above the line where the shadows began, he saw it. A set of eyes, no, not eyes, but pits of blackness, emerged from the figure's face. At first they were hidden by the swirling darkness that clung to its form, but then they pierced through the shadows, and the darkness shifted, exposing the empty sockets where eyes should have been. They were deep, hollow voids, darker than the night itself, pulling at his very soul. threatening to swallow him whole. The weight of those voids pressed against his chest, and he staggered back, nearly falling to the ground. His heart raced as he stumbled, the cold sweat clinging to his skin. He had to get away. He had to. Snap. The sound echoed through the trees like a branch breaking underfoot. He froze, eyes wide, unable to move. It was too close. It was too real. He had heard that sound before, but not here. Not in this place. That snap, that crack, had come from behind him. It came from the very forest that had once seemed like a refuge, the trees that had stood still in the distance. His breath hitched as he turned slowly, the air growing colder with every passing second, the shadows stretching toward him like tendrils. The ground beneath him felt slick with something cold, and when he looked down, he saw it, dark, inky soil, as if the earth itself had become alive with malice. The snap came again, closer this time, a heavy, unnatural sound that vibrated through his bones. And then the shadows moved. The trees parted like a curtain being drawn back, revealing a shape, a dark, hunched figure, its limbs long and twisted, its body bent in an unnatural way. It crawled forward on all fours, its head tilting at an odd angle, as though it were watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure in the clearing, the one that had been motionless, watching him, did not move. But the new creature, the one that had emerged from the darkness, did. It was the same. And yet, it wasn't. It was like a twisted reflection, a distorted mirror of the figure that had haunted him from the beginning. Its eyes, those hollow, empty pits, seemed to swirl, spinning in a vortex of shadow and light. It didn't have a face, just that unholy darkness, and the longer he stared at it, the more he felt his mind begin to unravel. Leave. The command echoed again, louder now, more insistent. But this time, it wasn't just a voice in his mind. No. This time it was coming from everywhere. The trees seemed to whisper it. The wind carried it. The earth beneath his feet seemed to throb with it. The ground cracked, splitting open like the jaws of some unseen beast, and his feet sank into the soil, as though the earth itself was swallowing him whole. Panic surged through him. He turned and bolted, his feet slipping in the slick, cold dirt. But the moment he did, the shadows followed. They slithered and writhed, reaching out for him like living things, closing in from all sides, curling around his legs, pulling at him. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the very air had thickened around him, choking his voice. The shadows were everywhere now, around him, in him, through him. His limbs felt like lead as the weight of the darkness pressed down on him, smothering him, crushing him. Every breath felt like it was his last, the very air heavy with the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. Leave, the voices whispered again. But this time, it was a demand. He tried to fight back, to free himself. But the shadows wouldn't let go. They clung to him, seeping into his skin, crawling under his nails, twisting around his throat. They knew him. They were a part of him. They were his fears, his regrets, his very soul wrapped in the form of a forest that no longer welcomed him. His vision began to blur, the world warping as the shadows wrapped themselves tighter around him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His heart thudded in his chest, and for the first time since he'd set foot in the forest, he understood the truth. There was no escape. He had been here before. He had always been here, and he was never leaving. The forest had claimed him. The last thing he saw before the shadows swallowed him whole were the eyes, the hollow pits of blackness that were always watching, always waiting, always remembering. And then, silence. The world was cold, too cold. It was as if he had been cast into the deepest of oceans, drowning in an expanse of ice, his limbs numb, his mind consumed by darkness. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The very air seemed to press against him, suffocating him with its weight. And yet, it wasn't just the darkness that was heavy. It was alive. Every corner of his existence felt haunted now, each sensation, each fleeting thought smothered by an unnatural force that seemed to stretch back into time itself, into something ancient, far older than the trees around him, older than the very earth beneath his feet. There was no light here, no warmth, no comfort, just the cold, the emptiness, and the suffocating shadows that were no longer just shapes, but real, tangible entities that lived inside of him. He opened his eyes, or he thought he did, but it made no difference. The blackness remained. He tried to scream, but the sound was stolen from him before it ever reached his lips. His throat burned with the effort, but the emptiness devoured his voice, his very essence. His mind was heavy with the pressure, each thought slipping through his grasp like water through cracked fingers. He wanted to scream again, to fight, to wake up, but the very concept of escape felt beyond him now. And then, as if in answer to his silent desperation, something shifted. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a feeling. The air, if it could still be called that, began to stir as though something long forgotten had awakened, something with an ancient hunger that had lain dormant beneath the soil, beneath the world itself, waiting. There was no place left for him to run, no way to hide. The shadows were not just around him anymore, they were inside him. He could feel them, creeping beneath his skin, crawling through his veins, feeding on his fear, on his thoughts, on his soul. They had always been with him, and now they were him. But just as the weight of despair threatened to pull him under completely, there came a voice. Not a whisper, not a sound. No, this voice reached him, not through his ears, but through his very being. It was ancient, like the forest itself, and it filled his body with a deep chill, so profound it felt like it was freezing his heart from the inside out. The voice was benevolent, but not in the way he would have expected. It was a kind of presence, one that wrapped around his soul and pressed into his thoughts like the ancient weight of a heavy fog. "You have come to the end, traveler." The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They resonated directly within him, like a truth. That was always there, always known. The voice was neither kind nor cruel. It simply was. He tried to answer, tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the dark. "You do not belong here. This place does not welcome you." He felt the weight of the truth in his bones, but something deep inside him, somewhere in the recesses of his panic, still fought against it. How, he thought. How can I leave? How can I escape this place? The voice didn't answer, but its presence grew stronger, more insistent. He could feel the essence of the forest now, the raw power of the land pressing in on him from every angle. It was as though he were inside the forest, every tree, every blade of grass, every animal and insect, all woven into one grand design, a force far beyond his understanding. It was then that he saw it. The darkness, which had been suffocating him, began to shift once more, though this time it wasn't closing in. No, it was parting, opening. The shadows withdrew, curling back into themselves like a fading storm. The ground, which had seemed to press against him with such force, softened, releasing its grip. He was no longer sinking. The oppressive weight that had been crushing him for what felt like an eternity began to ease, the cold retreating like the tide pulling away from the shore. He looked around. The world had shifted again. He was standing in a clearing. A familiar one, though in his mind it didn't make sense. This was his clearing, the one where he had set up camp. The same place where everything had gone wrong. Yet everything had changed. The trees were different now, taller, more ancient, together, forming a canopy above that blocked out the sky. The air was no longer suffocating but alive, buzzing with an energy that hummed through his body. The shadows had returned to their rightful places, but they were no longer oppressive. They were just shadows. His tent stood before him, undisturbed. The fire pit was untouched, the remnants of embers still glowing faintly in the center. His pack sat beside it, as if nothing had ever happened. He could even hear the faint, comforting sound of crickets. In the distance, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. But there was something wrong. It felt wrong. He felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. His breath caught in his throat as he realized it. The strange feeling of displacement. He reached for his arm, but the sensation was foreign. His hands. Were they his hands? He looked down at them, his breath coming faster as he saw his fingers, pale and thin, trembling slightly. There was something different, something alien about them. They felt like someone else's. It was as though he were outside himself, watching the world unfold from behind a thick, unseen barrier. But no, his body was still here. This was still his body. But then, who am I now? The thought pierced through him like a blade, sharp and brutal, as if it had just occurred to him. The world around him, though seemingly familiar, was a distant memory, a dream that he could no longer touch, that he could never return to. The shadows at the edge of the clearing stirred again, and he felt the familiar pull of the void. That voice resonated once more. You are not the same. Not anymore. This place has marked you. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches stretching as if to whisper their ancient secrets. The wind picked up, but there was no sound. The entire forest held its breath, as if waiting for him to make a choice. And then, the final truth struck him. The forest was not an enemy. It wasn't a force to fight against. It wasn't something he had stumbled into. No, he belonged here. He had always belonged here. He was part of the forest now. It was as though the earth beneath him recognized him. The trees around him knew his name. He was part of the soil, part of the shadows, part of the ancient, endless cycle. He had been swallowed, yes, but only to be reborn. And as he stepped forward towards the place where his fire had burned, he understood. He would never leave. Not now. Not ever. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and though the world around him seemed familiar, it was foreign all the same. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The trees that loomed tall above him, their gnarled branches stretching outward like arms reaching to hold him, to cradle him in an eternal, unbreakable bond. The clearing, once his escape, was now a place of suffocating inevitability. He moved toward the fire pit, his feet sinking slightly into the soft earth as he walked. Each step was heavy, deliberate, like a force beyond his control was pulling him deeper into the forest's embrace. He tried to fight it, but his legs were sluggish, as though they belonged to someone else, someone who had been here for far longer than he ever realized. The tent was still standing in the same place it had been before. The fabric rustled in. The wind, though it wasn't the wind that made it move. It was something deeper, something more primal. He reached out to touch the canvas, but as his fingers brushed against the material, a shock ran through his body, a jolt of recognition. This is my tent. This is where it all began. His mind screamed at him, tried to force a sense of rebellion, a desperate plea to wake up, but he couldn't. He couldn't wake up because he had already awoken. He had already crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. Behind him, the shadows of the trees seemed to move, shifting, bending unnaturally. They twisted and pulsed like living things, hungry and ever watchful. The forest itself felt alive, more alive than it ever had before. It knew him, and it was waiting. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. Something large moved through the trees, its form indistinct, its shape hidden behind the dense thicket. The growl was low, guttural, but it wasn't a sound to fear. It was a sound of recognition, a part of the forest moving closer to claim its own. The cold, dark voice of the forest echoed once again in his mind, this time softer, but no less powerful. "You are home." He couldn't breathe. The words swirled through his head, deeper than anything rational, deeper than any human understanding. He had always been here. He had always been a part of this place even before the forest claimed him. It wasn't the trees or the creatures that had shaped him. It was the forest's hunger, the endless need to feed, to consume, to belong. His eyes darted around, and he saw them now. The eyes. They peered out from the darkness between the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. Hundreds of them, dozens, all watching, all waiting. They were part of the forest just like him now. They were connected, linked in ways he couldn't understand. The hunger that ran through the ground, through the air, through his veins was their hunger. Something stepped out from the shadows, a figure, impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Its face was hidden beneath the dark hood of its cloak, its form wrapped in the forest's eternal cloak of shadows. It was the figure he had seen before, the one that had whispered to him, the one that had always been watching, waiting. And now it stepped toward him. The ground trembled beneath his feet, the earth itself groaning under the weight of its presence. The trees swayed, their branches creaking as if in warning. "You have returned," the figure said, its voice soft but commanding. It was neither malevolent nor kind. It simply was. "You have come back to the place you were always meant to be." He wanted to scream, to shout, to break free of this endless cycle, but his voice failed him. His throat was tight, as though he had no words left to say. The figure reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers long and graceful. Its touch, when it landed on his shoulder, felt like ice, sending a shiver through his bones, but it wasn't pain. It was something deeper, something that went beyond his flesh and bones, reaching into the core of his being. "It is time to accept what you are." The words settled in his mind like stone. There was no room for argument, no room for rejection. The forest had shaped him. The shadows had claimed him. He had already given himself to this place, without even realizing it. Every step he had taken, every decision he had made had led him here, into the forest's embrace. He was part of it now. He turned slowly, almost without thought, and saw the shifting shadows once more. They were moving toward him, closing in from every angle, crawling up his legs like thick, cold tendrils. They wrapped around his arms, binding him, pulling him down into the soil. The forest was swallowing him whole. He felt no fear now, only an odd sense of peace. The hunger was not his to resist, it was his to embrace. The whispers began again, not in his mind this time, but all around him. The voices of the forest, the voices of the shadows. They filled the air like a chorus, singing a song he had always known but never understood. He was the forest. He was the shadows. He was the very earth beneath his feet. The figure that stood beside him. Was it him? Was it something else? He couldn't say. The lines between what was him and what was the forest began to blur. There were no distinctions anymore. His thoughts, his fears, his desires, they were all part of the forest now. He had always been part of it. The hunger, the cold, the shadows, they were all his. He was the forest's voice. His body, no longer his own, was one with the land. His veins pulsed with the rhythm of the earth. His breath became the rustle of leaves, his heartbeat the thud of distant storms. His skin, once a boundary, was now the bark of the trees. His thoughts, once his own, now mingled with the whispers of those who had walked before him and those who would walk after. The figure beside him stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. The forest embraced him fully now, the shadows wrapping around him, pulling him deeper, sinking him into the very soil itself. He felt the earth, cold and damp, take him in, and he welcomed it. His last breath, if it could even be called that, was a sigh, a deep exhale of surrender, and then there was only silence. The forest's voice. It was as if the very air had closed in, as if time had stopped, as if he had become a part of something vast and eternal. The forest had claimed him. It had always been his home, and now the forest was him. And in the end, there was no escape from the embrace of the shadows, only the stillness of eternity. The silence stretched like an unbroken thread, deep and suffocating, wrapping the clearing in a blanket that stifled every movement, every thought. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of stillness that felt like the very air had stopped breathing, as if time had slowed down to the crawl of eternity itself. He couldn't tell if he was still standing, still existing in the way he once had. The last breath he had taken, the one that had surrendered him to the forest's depths, felt as distant as a forgotten dream. The place he had once known as his own body no longer seemed to belong to him. It was different. No, it wasn't his body. Not anymore. The shadows that had enveloped him, that had wrapped themselves so tightly around his form, were not just a prison. They were a transformation. They were him now, weaving through his mind, through his thoughts, slipping beneath his skin like threads of darkness, stitching him back together. He felt whole, but not in the way he had before. This was something else, something deeper, something older. And yet, within that overwhelming sense of unity, there was something else that lingered. A subtle tug, a whisper in the back of his mind, faint but undeniable. Who was he? He tried to grasp the question, but it slipped away like smoke. His memories felt distant, as if they had been swept away by the same wind that carried the whispers of the trees. He remembered. He remembered being a man, alone in the woods, setting up camp, trying to escape. But that man, that person, felt like a ghost. The forest's embrace had taken him. No longer a visitor, no longer an intruder, but a part of the very land itself. The memories, what remained of them, stirred. They were jagged, incomplete fragments, like shattered pieces of glass that no longer fit together. Who was he? The whisper grew louder, more insistent, coming not from the trees now, but from somewhere deep within the forest's heart, a voice that was part of him, yet not. Who were you? He felt his mind bend toward the question, reaching for answers, but they remained out of reach, buried beneath layers of something too vast, too old to be understood. It was the voice of the forest, the one that had claimed him, the one that had always been there, watching, waiting. And then it came, the truth. A sudden flash, an image vivid and horrifying broke through the thick fog of his mind. He saw himself, standing in the clearing, but the version of him that he saw was different. The skin was darker, like the bark of the ancient trees that surrounded him, and his eyes glowed with that same otherworldly hue as the depths of the forest. He was no longer human. He had never been human. He had been born here, in the shadow of the forest, a product of its hunger, a sacrifice to its endless, insatiable need. The man who had wandered into these woods, searching for solitude, had been a fool. The forest had called to him long before his first step on the trail. It had known him from the very moment his feet had touched the earth. He had always belonged here, and his body, his soul, had been marked long ago. The forest, the ancient twisted heart of it, had claimed him, yes, but it had also made him a part of its eternal cycle. He wasn't just a victim, he was a reflection, a mirror of the forest's hunger, its desire to grow, to consume, to become more. But there was more. The voice, still humming within the recesses of his mind, spoke again, not with words, but with truth. You are the forest, but you were also once its creator. The realization hit him like a flood, drowning him in a torrent of memories that were not his own. The pain of it was like claws digging into his soul, pulling him apart. He saw through the eyes of something older, something that had lived long before him. He had been here before. In a time that stretched beyond memory, he had stood in this same place, wearing a different face, and had performed the ritual that had awakened the forest's hunger. He had called it into being, offered his life and soul in exchange for something the forest had promised, something that had always been, promised to those who dared make a pact with the land, immortality, but the forest never gave. It took everything. It took the soul and twisted it, fed it back into the soil where it would grow again, renewed, always growing, always feeding. Every creature that entered this forest, every soul that dared to walk its path, became part of the cycle. And now he had returned to finish the endless loop. He had returned because the forest had always known he would. It had waited for him to return, to become. The forest was his punishment and his legacy. The memories flooded in, each one a piece of a puzzle too vast to comprehend. He had come here before, a wanderer seeking peace. But peace had never been offered. His arrival had been part of a much older plan. The forest had always chosen him, and always would. It would claim those who dared to enter, those who sought to escape the world. It did not let them go, not ever. As the truth settled over him, the world around him seemed to solidify. He was no longer standing alone in the clearing. He was standing among countless others. Faces, shadows, memories that had been buried in the very soil, in the bark of the trees, in the wind that whistled through the branches. The forest was full of them, full of the forgotten, the lost souls, who had been claimed and reborn. Each face held a memory, his memory, each pair of eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. And then it was clear. He had never left the forest, the path he had walked, the tent he had pitched, the fire he had built. All of it had been an illusion. The forest had always been here, and he had always been a part of it. The trees that surrounded him were not just trees. They were the guardians of the land, the keepers of the lost. They knew him. They were him. The whispers were his own thoughts, echoing through the woods. He was no longer a wanderer. He was part of the forest's endless cycle, trapped in its eternal hunger, trapped in the land's insatiable need to consume and grow. And now, as he felt the pull of the earth once more, he realized there was no escape. The forest did not just take lives, it took souls, and when it had finished with them, it returned them to the soil, to grow, to feed again. As the shadows closed in around him, wrapping him in their cold, ancient embrace, he knew the truth. He would never leave this place. He would always be here, buried deep in the soil, waiting for the next soul to wander into the clearing. And when they did, he would be there, watching, waiting, just as the forest had always waited for him, forever. The trees whispered as they swayed in the unearthly wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, their leaves rustling with an ancient, unfathomable song. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of something alive, something that had lived for eons. And as the shadows stretched, drawing him closer to the heart of the forest, he felt the weight of it all. The forest had always been his home. It had always owned him, even before he had ever set foot within it. The voices, once so distant, were now as clear as his own thoughts. They surrounded him, humming in the air, speaking not with words, but with truths. Their collective voice carried a resonance, a familiar pulse that echoed through his veins. They were his ancestors, his predecessors, the ones who had made the same fateful decision to wander into the woods, to offer themselves to the forest's insatiable hunger. He had joined them. The ground beneath him trembled, the pulse of the forest vibrating through his very being. The soil, the roots, the ancient stones, they knew him. His feet sank deeper, not into the dirt, but into the soul of the forest itself. The shadows wrapped tighter around him, their cold touch seeping into his skin, into his blood, into the marrow of his bones. They weren't just binding him to the land, they were remaking him. For a moment, the weight of that thought felt too much to bear. He struggled to remember what it was like to be free, to feel the wind in his hair and the sun on his face. But it was a fleeting memory, one that slipped away as easily as it had come. He was no longer that man. He wasn't even human anymore. He was part of the forest, part of its dark and twisted cycle. There was no more escape, no more running. The forest had claimed him, and he had willingly offered himself up to it, a piece of its insatiable hunger. But the truth was, there was no end to this cycle, not for him, not for anyone who walked these woods. He felt something stir within him, a voice, faint but insistent, a familiar tug in his mind, like the echo of a memory he couldn't fully grasp. A flash of his own face, a younger version of him, standing at the edge of the clearing, eyes wide with fear. The man who had walked into these woods, who had set up camp, who had tried to escape. It's not too late, the voice whispered. But it wasn't the forest now. It was his own voice, before. For a moment, he felt the stirrings of resistance, the faintest spark of rebellion. A desperate need to run, to leave, to tear himself away from the hunger that gnawed at him, to escape the pull of the forest that held him so tightly. But it was a fleeting thought. The forest had already consumed him. He could feel it now, deep, within the very fabric of his being. His thoughts weren't his own anymore. They were the forest's thoughts. His memories were distorted, fractured, twisted into something else entirely. His identity, his self, was dissolving into the earth, into the roots, into the ever-growing, insatiable hunger of the forest. A deep rumbling filled the air, vibrating through the ground, through his body, through his very soul. The trees, the shadows, the voices, they were all merging now, all becoming one. The cycle had come full circle. The forest had claimed him, and now it would pass on that claim to someone else. The cycle would continue, and as the forest's ancient hunger reached its climax, he felt himself being drawn down into the earth deeper than before. The soil beneath him, which had once been just dirt and rock, now felt like home. The roots entwining with his flesh, the darkness pulsing through his veins, the whispers of the lost souls calling to him, pulling him down. He was not alone. He could feel them, the others. Their eyes, those same glowing, hungry eyes, stared at him from the depths of the forest. They had once been like him. They had once been lost souls, wandering the woods, seeking solace or escape. Now, they were part of the forest, just as he would be. The ground broke open, and he sank deeper, the earth welcoming him with open arms, with open roots, with open hunger. The forest's roots wrapped around him, pulling him down into the dark void beneath the soil, where the ancient trees grew taller and darker, where the shadows thrived, where the hunger fed. And in that final, terrible moment, he understood. The forest did not just take souls, it rebirthed them, the souls of the lost, the souls of the forgotten, the souls of those who wandered into the woods seeking peace or escape. They all became part of the land. They were fed into the soil, their memories, their essence, consumed and nourished by the hunger of the earth. They were not lost, they were changed. They became the very trees, the shadows, the whispers that haunted the woods. They were reborn, and as he was pulled deeper into the earth, into the center of the forest's vast, insatiable heart, he knew he would return. There would be another soul, another wanderer who would cross this path. They would set up camp, thinking they were alone, thinking they could escape. They would see the shadows, hear the whispers, and they would feel the pull. And he, the forest, would wait, because the cycle never ended. It was always waiting to begin again. And in the dark beneath the earth, a voice, his voice, whispered, "Once more, leave." It was a warning, a beckoning, a promise for the next soul that would come. And then the darkness swallowed everything.